Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey into a tale so peculiar, so utterly macabre, it seems plucked from the darkest corners of a Gothic novel. We're delving into the bizarre case of a king who, quite literally, rotted alive, a slow, agonising dissolution that left his body and indeed his kingdom in a state of unsettling decay. They probably won't survive this. Imagine, if you will, the opulent chambers of a monarch, usually abuzz with courtiers and filled with the scent of perfumes and fresh flowers, slowly, inexorably succumbing to an unbearable stench. Picture the vibrant health of a powerful ruler draining away, not in a sudden dramatic flourish, but in a gradual putrefying process that defied all medical knowledge of the age. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The curtain rises on Philip II, a monarch whose reign, for all its political machinations and territorial ambitions, would be tragically overshadowed by the horrifying manner of his death. He is, at first glance, a man of robust constitution, in the prime of his life, his presence commanding, his intellect sharp. Yet, a subtle shift begins to manifest, almost imperceptibly at first, like a faint discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. It starts with a persistent malaise, a vague sense of unease that he, being a king accustomed to absolute power and boundless energy, initially dismisses. Perhaps it's merely the fatigue of endless council meetings, the strain of managing an empire that stretches across continents, or the lingering effects of a particularly rich meal. He pushes through it, as kings are wont to do, believing his formidable will can simply override any minor physical discomfort. After all, he has battled rebellions, outmaneuvered rivals, and guided his nation through tempestuous political waters. A mere feeling unwell seems trivial in comparison. But the malaise deepens. What began as a general fatigue morphs into something more specific, more insidious. He complains of a gnawing ache in his joints, a weariness that sleep cannot alleviate, and a fever that flickers and fades, leaving him clammy and disoriented. The royal physicians, a collection of the era's most esteemed medical minds, are summoned. They are men of great learning, steeped in the humoral theories of Hippocrates and Galen, armed with an array of tinctures, poultices, and pronouncements based on the delicate balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They cluster around their royal patient, their brows furrowed in concern, their Latin phrases flowing like a complex incantation. They examine his tongue, feel his pulse, scrutinize his urine, each a vital clue in their diagnostic quest. Initially, their consensus leans towards a common ailment, perhaps an imbalance of humours brought on by a cold or excessive indulgence in rich foods. They prescribe purges, bleedings, and dietary restrictions, all the conventional wisdom of the day applied with the utmost diligence and reverence for their royal charge. Yet, Philip's condition stubbornly refuses to improve. In fact, it seems to take a perverse turn, developing symptoms that defy their conventional wisdom. His skin, once clear and vibrant, begins to develop an unsettling pallor, tinged with a yellowish hue that hints at deeper systemic issues. Then, the itching starts, an incessant tormenting itch that drives him to distraction, even in his moments of deepest exhaustion. He scratches, almost unconsciously at first, then with increasing desperation, leaving angry red welts and small abrasions across his body. The physicians observe this with growing consternation. This is no mere imbalance of humours. This is something altogether more sinister, a malady that seems to unravel the very fabric of the king's robust health. They consult ancient texts, debate esoteric theories, and even resort to more obscure remedies, some involving crushed pearls, others the ashes of rare herbs. It's a bit like trying to fix a supercomputer with a wrench and a prayer, given the limitations of 16th century medicine. As the days bleed into weeks, a new and deeply unsettling symptom emerges, an odour. It is faint at first, easily dismissed as the lingering scent of old linen or an uncleaned chamber pot. But it grows, slowly, persistently, from a subtle unpleasantness to a pervasive, unmistakable reek. It clings to Philip, to his clothes, to the very air of his bedchamber like a suffocating shroud. The courtiers, ever attuned to the king's state, begin to notice. They try to disguise it with perfumes and incense, but the sweet fragrances only mingle with the foulness, creating a sickeningly cloying miasma. Historians still argue whether the initial manifestation of this odour was purely internal, or if it was exacerbated by external factors such as poor hygiene, though the latter seems unlikely given royal standards of cleanliness, however rudimentary by modern measures. The king's attendants, sworn to silence and loyalty, bear the brunt of it, their faces carefully neutral as they assist their sovereign, their stomachs churning. The physicians, too, are confronted by this putrid reality, their learned theories offering no explanation for a king who smells as if he is already half buried. The progression of the illness continues its relentless march. The fever becomes more persistent, the aches more profound. Philip's once keen mind, though still lucid for stretches, begins to cloud, moments of confusion interspersing with his flashes of sharp intellect. His appetite wanes, and even the most exquisitely prepared dishes fail to entice him. He grows thin, his once powerful frame now appearing almost fragile, his movements slow and deliberate, each step a visible effort. He's no longer the commanding figure who strides confidently through the halls of power. He's a man besieged, his own body turning against him in a betrayal more profound than any political conspiracy. It's like watching a grand old ship slowly, inexorably take on water, listing heavily, its once proud sails drooping limply against the mast. The medical establishment, for all its self-assured pronouncements, finds itself in uncharted waters. They diagnose melancholy, excess of black bile, humoral imbalance, and a litany of other impressive-sounding terms, but none truly grasp the terrifying reality unfolding before them. They administer emetics to induce vomiting, believing it will expel toxic humours. They apply leeches, hoping to draw out the diseased blood. They concoct bizarre mixtures from exotic plants and minerals, some imported at great expense from distant lands, reflecting the era's fascination with far-off remedies, a sort of ancient high-stakes homeopathy. The king, desperate for relief, submits to it all, enduring the bitter tastes, the intrusive procedures, the indignity of a body that is no longer his own. He is trapped within it, a prisoner in a decaying fortress. The court, once a vibrant hub of activity, grows quiet, almost sombre. The usual laughter, the clinking of goblets, the murmur of ambitious conversations, all dim in the shadow of the king's deepening illness. Courtiers move with hushed steps, their whispers replacing their usual boisterous chatter. The air of anxiety is palpable, a thick unspoken dread that permeates the very stone walls of the palace. For a king's illness is not merely a private affliction. It is a national crisis, a tremor that shakes the foundations of the realm. Succession, stability, alliances, everything hangs in the balance. Even the most hardened politician, accustomed to the ruthless games of power, feels the chill of this unprecedented decay. The future of an entire empire rests precariously on the increasingly frail shoulders of a man who is, quite literally, dissolving before their very eyes. It's enough to make a seasoned bureaucrat reach for the nearest strong drink, if only to dull the nagging fear that his own career might also be putrefying. Philip's early life, ironically, stood in stark contrast to the macabre twilight that would eventually envelop him. He was born into power, destined for the throne, and possessed of a constitution that seemed as robust and enduring as the stone walls of his ancestral castles. He was a vigorous youth, delighting in the hunt, mastering the martial arts, and displaying a keen intellect that promised a formidable reign. His physical prowess was often remarked upon by chroniclers, who painted a picture of a king who in his younger days could ride for hours, enduring the rigours of travel and the demands of state with an almost indefatigable energy. He was a man of impressive stature, not a giant, but certainly possessing a commanding presence that filled a room, his gaze direct, his movements purposeful. He ate heartily, slept soundly, and seemed to embody the very picture of health, a stark and chilling juxtaposition to the horrors that awaited him. It was as if destiny, with a cruel sense of irony, had built him up only to orchestrate a more dramatic and terrifying downfall. Yet, even in his vigorous youth, subtle undertones of a darker fate were whispered by those who claimed a connection to the arcane, the prophetic, or merely the superstitious. There were rumours, persistent and unsettling, of ancient prophecies concerning the lineage, vague pronouncements of a king whose end would be unlike any other. Some spoke of a slow, consuming illness, not of fever or sudden collapse, but of a gradual fading, a decay from within that would mirror the decline of empires. These were not mainstream predictions, of course, but rather the fringe tidbits that circulated among the lower echelons of the court, among those who consulted astrologers or folk healers, or simply enjoyed the thrill of a good spine-tingling tale. They were the sort of stories dismissed by rational minds, yet they clung to the periphery of the royal narrative like persistent shadows. Historians still argue whether these prophecies were genuinely prescient observations based on subtle early signs, or merely post-facto rationalizations to make sense of an otherwise incomprehensible demise. One particularly chilling anecdote spoke of a wandering mystic who, upon seeing the young Philip, had allegedly recoiled, muttering about the earth reclaiming its own even before the grave. Such pronouncements were usually disregarded as the ramblings of madmen or charlatans, yet in hindsight, as the king's condition deteriorated, these forgotten whispers began to resurface in the minds of those who remembered them, lending an eerie prescience to what was unfolding. It's a bit like someone predicting a gloomy forecast and then a hurricane hits. Suddenly everyone remembers the forecast no matter how vague it was. These prophecies, even if concocted after the fact, underscored the profound disquiet and the sense of the unnatural that surrounded Philip's illness. It was a malady so unusual, so devoid of a clear explanation, that people naturally sought comfort or meaning in the supernatural. The initial stages of his affliction were, as mentioned, subtle enough to be brushed aside by a man of Philip's temperament. He was not one to dwell on minor discomforts. His life was one of constant motion, endless responsibilities, and the weighty decisions that shaped nations. He believed in action, in pushing forward, and so he pushed through the fatigue, the intermittent fevers, and the growing aches. He continued to hold court, to receive ambassadors, to pore over maps and dispatches, his formidable willpower overriding the early warnings from his own body. This stoicism, admirable in many respects, ironically contributed to the delay in fully grasping the severity of his situation. Had he been a lesser man, perhaps less accustomed to enduring hardship, the alarm bells might have rung sooner. But kings, especially kings of his calibre, are often loath to admit weakness. The royal physicians initially were also somewhat complacent. They were accustomed to the common ailments that plagued royalty: gout from rich food, fevers from seasonal changes, the occasional bout of dysentery. Philip's early symptoms fit comfortably into these familiar categories. They followed their established protocols, prescribing the usual purges and bleedings, confident in their centuries-old medical traditions. They were, in essence, operating within a very limited framework of understanding, much like trying to debug a complex software program with only a basic understanding of its operating system. Their knowledge of anatomy was rudimentary, their understanding of pathology virtually non-existent by modern standards, and their diagnostic tools limited to observation and palpation. The concept of microscopic pathogens, for instance, was centuries away from being conceived, let alone understood. As the illness progressed, however, the complacency gave way to confusion and then to growing alarm. The king's symptoms were not responding to the standard treatments. The fevers grew more tenacious, the pain more intense, and the peculiar odour, once dismissed as perhaps poor ventilation or a spilled unguent, became undeniably linked to the king himself. This was unprecedented. A king, the very embodiment of the state's health and vigour, was visibly and palpably decaying. The physicians began to look at one another with increasingly worried expressions, their confident pronouncements replaced by hesitant theories and whispered consultations. They consulted every available text, from the Arab scholars to the rediscovered Greek masters, searching for a parallel, a precedent, anything that might illuminate this darkening mystery. It was a bit like a seasoned detective confronting a crime scene that defies all known patterns. The clues are there, but they make no sense. The peculiar yellowish tinge to Philip's skin, initially dismissed as a sign of bile imbalance, grew more pronounced, deepening to an almost jaundiced hue. The incessant itching, which caused him to scratch himself raw, developed into something more disturbing: small lesions, pustules, and patches of inflamed skin that refused to heal. These open wounds, in turn, became potential entry points for infection, although the concept of infection as we understand it was still a nebulous one. The physicians, seeing these external manifestations, were further baffled. Was it a skin disease, a manifestation of internal corruption, or something entirely new, a malady unseen in their medical annals? They tried ointments and poultices, but these seemed to offer little relief, and in some cases might have even exacerbated the problem. The odour, however, remained the most distressing and undeniable symptom. It was not merely the smell of sickness, it was the smell of decay, of putrefaction, a smell that evoked charnel houses and death, not the chambers of a living king. This was the symptom that truly broke through the polite fictions of courtly life, a crude, undeniable reality that even the most obsequious courtier could not ignore. It seeped into the tapestries, permeated the very air, and clung to those who spent any significant time in the king's presence. It was a constant, offensive reminder that something fundamentally unnatural was happening to their sovereign. It led to a quiet, almost imperceptible social distancing around the king, as courtiers found excuses to limit their exposure, though none would dare openly admit it. A subtle rearrangement of seating charts, a sudden urgency to attend to other matters, these were the telltale signs of people trying to avoid a smell that threatened to make them physically ill. One could almost hear the collective sigh of relief when the king concluded an audience. As the king's physical state deteriorated, so too did the morale of the court. The air became heavy with unspoken anxieties. The once vibrant palace, a symbol of power and continuity, began to feel like a tomb in waiting. The royal family naturally was in a state of profound distress, caught between their love for the king and the horrifying reality of his condition. The future, once so clearly defined by the succession of the king's healthy line, now seemed shrouded in uncertainty. How long could a monarch so visibly afflicted continue to rule effectively? How would his physical decay impact his authority, both at home and abroad? These were the questions whispered behind closed doors, their answers dreaded. The king himself, despite his mounting physical agony, still clung to his duties. He held audiences from his bedchamber, his voice often weak, his movements laboured, but his mind still attempting to grasp the reins of power. He would summon his ministers, his eyes, though often clouded with pain, still holding a spark of his former intensity. This determination, even in the face of such overwhelming decay, was a testament to his indomitable will, but it also painted a profoundly tragic picture. He was a king fighting not only for his life, but for the very dignity of his office, even as his body betrayed him in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. It was a struggle against the inevitable, a valiant last stand against an enemy that consumed him from within. The royal physicians, initially so confident in their time-honoured practices, soon found themselves caught in a professional nightmare, their expertise, their very understanding of the human body, failing them spectacularly. They were, in essence, the rock stars of medieval medicine, revered for their knowledge of ancient texts and their ability to interpret the subtle signs of the body. But Philip's malady was a discordant symphony that defied their entire repertoire. Their initial diagnoses rooted deeply in the humoral theory, the belief that the body's health depended on the balance of 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, proved utterly inadequate. They spoke of an excess of black bile, a common diagnosis for melancholic temperaments or chronic illness, but the king's symptoms went far beyond mere depression or sluggishness. He wasn't just sad, he was actively, visibly rotting. Their consultations grew more frequent, their debates more heated, yet their solutions remained stubbornly ineffectual. They employed the full arsenal of their craft, each treatment more desperate and less successful than the last. Bleedings were ordered, sometimes several times a day, to drain the bad humours. They believed that by opening a vein, usually in the arm or leg, they could release the accumulated toxins, a practice that, in retrospect, likely only weakened the king further. Imagine the king, already frail, enduring the constant loss of blood, his vitality draining away with each red drop. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing gasoline on it, with the best of intentions, of course. Then there were the purges, emetics, made from various herbs and sometimes even more questionable substances, were administered to induce violent vomiting, believed to expel corrupt humours from the stomach. Laxatives, often incredibly harsh and irritating, were given to clear the bowels, another route for expelling internal poisons. The king, already in agony from his primary condition, now suffered the additional torments of constant nausea, cramping, and debilitating weakness from the relentless purging of his system. One can only imagine the sheer misery of a monarch, accustomed to deference and luxury, reduced to such a state of physical distress, his every bodily function scrutinised and manipulated by a desperate medical team. Baths were prescribed, not for hygiene, but for therapeutic purposes. Some were cold, believed to cool fevers, while others were scalding hot, laced with various minerals and herbs, intended to draw out impurities through the skin. Poultices of crushed plants, animal parts, and even excrement were applied to the festering lesions on his skin, in the earnest but misguided belief that they would draw out the corruption. The stench from these concoctions, added to the king's own putrid odour, must have made his chambers a truly horrifying place to endure. There's a quirky historical tidbit about physicians sometimes using live frogs or pigeons applied to the affected areas, believing the creatures would absorb the illness. One can only wonder if such desperate measures were considered or even attempted on Philip II. The search for a cure led them to increasingly exotic and rare ingredients. Gold leaf, thought to have restorative properties due to its perceived purity and incorruptibility, was sometimes ingested or applied. Powdered pearls, expensive and rare, were dissolved in drinks, believed to strengthen the heart and purify the blood. Ground unicorn horn, a mythical substance believed to be an antidote to all poisons, would have been sought after if available, highlighting the blend of nascent science and pervasive superstition that characterized medicine of the era. The sheer cost of these treatments alone would have bankrupted a lesser kingdom, but for a monarch as wealthy as Philip, no expense was spared in the desperate quest for a cure. The physicians found themselves in a precarious position. Their careers, their reputations, even their very lives depended on their ability to heal the king. Failure was not an option, yet success eluded them at every turn. They held frantic consultations, poring over ancient texts by Avicenna, Galen and Hippocrates, searching for any obscure reference, any forgotten cure that might shed light on this unprecedented case. They debated whether the affliction was truly physical, or if it had a spiritual component, perhaps a divine punishment or even a curse. This open scholarly debate regarding the king's illness, particularly its etiology, raged not just among the physicians, but also among theologians and court philosophers. Some whispered of demonic possession, others of astrological alignments, reflecting the fragmented and often superstitious worldview of the time. One particularly terrifying theory that began to gain traction among the most desperate physicians was the idea of internal putrefaction. They observed the external decay, the lesions, the odour, and reasoned that the same process must be occurring within the king's body. This was a horrifying thought, suggesting that the king was literally rotting from the inside out. This theory, while chillingly accurate in its description of the symptoms, offered no practical solution beyond more aggressive purging and bleeding, which only served to hasten his decline. They were trapped in a loop of observation and ineffective intervention. The mental toll on the king during this period must have been immense. He was a man of great pride and dignity, accustomed to projecting an image of strength and invulnerability. To be reduced to such a state, his body a source of revulsion, his every discomfort attended to by a team of increasingly bewildered physicians, must have been a profound humiliation. He was conscious for much of it, aware of the growing stench, the alarmed glances of his attendants, the futility of the treatments. Imagine the despair of knowing your body is betraying you piece by piece, and that the most learned men in your kingdom are powerless to stop it. It's like being trapped in a slowly collapsing building, fully aware of your impending doom. As the physical symptoms intensified, so did the psychological distress. Sleep became almost impossible, disturbed by pain, itching, and the knowledge of his own decaying state. His dreams, if he had any, must have been nightmares of putrescence and dissolution. He would lie in his richly embroidered bed, surrounded by the trappings of power, yet utterly helpless against the enemy within. His voice, once resonant and commanding, grew hoarse and weak, making communication an effort. His movements became agonizingly slow, each turn in bed a monumental task requiring assistance. The physicians, under immense pressure from the court and the royal family, continued their efforts with a grim determination. They were experimenting in the dark, throwing every possible remedy at an unknown enemy, hoping that something, anything, would stick. They tried hot compresses, cold compresses, strange poultices made from pigeon droppings, and even the application of magnets, believing in their mystical healing properties. Some suggested taking the king to different climates, hoping a change of air might prove beneficial, a primitive understanding of environment's impact on health. Others advocated for more drastic measures, perhaps even rudimentary surgical interventions, though the risks of infection were so high that such procedures were rarely performed unless death was otherwise imminent. The idea of cutting into a body already consumed by decay was horrifying even for them. In their desperation, some physicians even turned to examining the king's feces and urine with an obsessive intensity, believing these excretions held the key to understanding the internal imbalances. They would note the colour, consistency, and smell, deriving complex and often erroneous conclusions from them. It was a macabre scientific pursuit, one that speaks to the limited tools available to them and their earnest but ultimately futile attempts to glean information from the body's refuse. This intense scrutiny, added to the constant physical interventions, stripped the king of any remaining shred of privacy or dignity. He was no longer a monarch, he was a medical specimen, a living testament to a baffling, terrifying disease. As Philip II's bizarre malady tightened its grip, the elaborate machinery of royal life, once running with the precision of a well-oiled clock, began to grind to a halt. His daily routines, which had once been a carefully choreographed dance of audiences, council meetings and state dinners, now unravelled into a chaotic succession of medical interventions and agonising periods of rest. The grand halls of the palace, usually bustling with the footsteps of courtiers and the murmur of diplomacy, grew quieter, mirroring the declining vitality of the king himself. It was as if the very air of the court was becoming as heavy and stagnant as the increasing effluvium emanating from the royal chambers. His mornings, once dedicated to receiving petitions and meeting with his most trusted advisers, were now dominated by the physicians. They would arrive with their various instruments and concoctions, their faces grim, their voices hushed. The king, who had once risen before dawn to attend to affairs of state, now struggled to even sit upright in his bed. The physical effort required for the simplest movements was immense, each shift of position a fresh wave of pain. His personal valets, long accustomed to assisting their robust monarch with his elaborate robes and regalia, now found themselves tending to a frail, decaying figure, their every action dictated by the king's growing weakness and the pervasive, sickening odour that clung to everything. It was a stark, almost theatrical descent from power and prestige into physical helplessness. The council meetings, the very heart of the kingdom's governance, became increasingly difficult to conduct. At first, Philip insisted on attending them in person, his willpower an incredible force against the encroaching illness. He would be propped up in his throne, his face pale and drawn, his voice weak but still trying to project authority. The ministers, though deeply concerned, maintained a facade of normalcy, delivering their reports and awaiting his decisions. But the sessions grew shorter, punctuated by the king's obvious discomfort, his need for rest, or the sudden uncontrollable itching that would force him to interrupt proceedings. Eventually attending in person became impossible. The council began to meet without him, a significant shift in the locus of power. Initially, decisions were relayed to the king's bedchamber for his final approval, but even this became a challenge. His concentration wavered, his mind clouded by pain and fever. Important documents would sit unread for days, vital dispatches unanswered. The flow of information, the lifeblood of any administration, slowed to a trickle, creating bottlenecks and delays that had serious implications for the kingdom's stability. It's like a massive engine slowly losing fuel, sputtering and eventually seizing up, leaving the entire mechanism stalled. Royal meals, once elaborate affairs designed to showcase the kingdom's bounty and the king's hospitality, became a mere formality. Philip's appetite had all but vanished, replaced by a persistent nausea. The exquisite dishes prepared by the royal chefs, once a source of delight, now lay untouched or were picked at with disinterest. The very thought of food often made him queasy. His nourishment became restricted to broths, thin gruels, and the occasional piece of fruit if he could stomach it. The decline in his intake only further weakened his already struggling body, creating a vicious cycle of decay and depletion. The lavishness of the meals served to underscore the king's tragic inability to partake in the simple pleasures of life, a cruel irony of his elevated position. Diplomatic functions suffered immensely. Ambassadors from foreign powers, accustomed to the grandeur and pomp of the Spanish court, now found themselves negotiating with increasingly distracted ministers, or, if they were granted an audience with the king, confronted by a disturbing spectacle. Imagine a foreign dignitary arriving to discuss a crucial alliance, being led into a chamber heavy with the scent of decay to find a king who was visibly deteriorating, his skin discoloured, his movements laboured, his voice barely a whisper. This presented a clear image of weakness, a vulnerability that rival nations would undoubtedly exploit. Philip, ever the shrewd statesman, understood this danger acutely, and the knowledge of his own failing health undermining his diplomatic efforts must have been a source of profound frustration and anguish. This vulnerability was a mainstream historical fact that deeply concerned his advisers and family. The court itself became a hive of hushed speculation and veiled ambition. The clear signs of the king's decline fueled a palpable anxiety among the nobility. Who would succeed him? Would there be a smooth transition, or would his weakness invite challenges to the throne, perhaps even civil unrest? Factions began to form, loyalties were quietly tested, and potential successors were scrutinised with renewed intensity. Those close to the king, particularly the highest-ranking nobles and clergy, began to consolidate their own power, preparing for the inevitable shift in the political landscape. The whispers grew louder, though never openly challenging the king's authority, yet everyone understood the unspoken implications. It was a dangerous dance, a delicate balance between showing respect for the ailing monarch and positioning oneself for the future. The pervasive odour, the one quirky or fringe tidbit that truly set this case apart, continued to be a source of immense discomfort and an undeniable indicator of the king's worsening state. Despite all efforts to mask it, with burning incense, vast quantities of fragrant oils, and open windows even in cold weather, the putrid smell clung stubbornly to the king and his surroundings. His attendants, devoted as they were, performed their duties with handkerchiefs pressed subtly to their noses or by finding reasons to quickly exit the royal chambers. The air in his private rooms became thick, almost tangible, with the sickly sweet and foul scent of decaying flesh. It was a constant, humiliating reminder of his body's revolt, a public declaration of his internal disintegration. This detail is often overlooked in broader historical narratives, but it was a crucial, visceral reality for those who lived through it. Even the king's personal comfort became an elusive dream. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and unsatisfying, often interrupted by bouts of coughing, pain, or the incessant itching. His mind, though still sharp in moments of clarity, was increasingly plagued by confusion and exhaustion. The grand canopy bed, once a symbol of his regal status, became a sick bed, a prison of pain and putrescence. He spent his days propped up by pillows, surrounded by worried faces, his once powerful hands now skeletal and trembling. The very act of eating, sleeping, and even breathing became a conscious, agonizing effort. The decline was relentless. The lesions on his skin, once small and isolated, spread across his body, becoming larger, deeper, and more numerous. Some began to weep fluid, adding to the pervasive dampness and smell. The skin itself seemed to lose its integrity, becoming fragile and easily damaged, almost as if it were dissolving. The constant pain and itching were an unimaginable torment, stripping him of any peace. Physicians would apply various poultices and salves, hoping to soothe the inflamed skin, but nothing seemed to halt the process. One can only imagine the sheer physical and mental endurance required to live through such an ordeal, day after agonizing day. Historians still argue whether Philip truly understood the nature of his horrific decline, or if his mind, in its moments of delirium, offered him some merciful escape from the reality of his rotting body. Did he comprehend that he was literally decaying while still alive, or did his illness obscure this most terrible truth? The records are vague on his precise mental state in the deepest throes of his illness, though they do indicate periods of lucidity alternating with confusion. What is clear, however, is the profound impact this bizarre physical disintegration had on his court and kingdom. It was a spectacle of suffering, a king's body becoming a ghastly mirror for the anxieties and uncertainties gripping his realm. The decay of the body politic, many feared, was reflected in the decaying body of the king. The king's isolation grew as his illness progressed. While his most loyal attendants remained by his side, the general flow of visitors diminished. People found reasons to avoid the royal presence, not out of malice, but out of a profound sense of discomfort and revulsion. The very air of his chambers was so foul that lingering there was an act of extreme loyalty and fortitude. This isolation, combined with his physical agony, must have intensified his suffering, cutting him off from the world he once so actively commanded. He was a king, surrounded by his court, yet utterly alone in his gruesome journey toward death. The once mighty monarch was now a pathetic figure, a living testament to the fragility of even the most powerful human beings. The unusual odours, once a subtle hint of Philip II's unseen malady, had now become an overwhelming, undeniable fact, a central character in the macabre drama unfolding within the palace walls. It was no longer a matter of discreetly placed censers or open windows. The smell permeated everything, a thick, cloying miasma that clung to fabrics, seeped into the very stonework, and became a constant, sickening presence in the royal apartments. It was the smell of decay, of putrefaction, of something actively, horrifyingly dying, yet still stubbornly alive. Imagine the worst possible combination of sickly sweetness and raw sewage, laced with the metallic tang of old blood, and you might begin to approach the reality of what the king's attendants and physicians had to endure daily. It was a smell that transcended mere unpleasantness. It induced nausea, headaches, and a profound sense of dread. Whispers about this putrid effluvium spread like wildfire through the court and beyond. Servants gossiped in hushed tones, their eyes wide with fear and morbid curiosity. Courtiers, usually so adept at masking their true feelings, found it increasingly difficult to conceal their revulsion, their polite smiles often twitching into grimaces as they left the royal presence. The rumour mill, ever active in any royal court, worked overtime, spinning tales of demonic possession, divine retribution, and ancient curses. The very air of the palace, once vibrant with the scent of ambition and power, now reeked of impending doom. It was a bizarre, almost comical scenario if it weren't so tragic. A king whose very body was broadcasting his decline to the entire court, louder than any royal decree. The physicians, despite their learned pronouncements and extensive academic backgrounds, were at a complete loss to explain the origin or nature of this pervasive stench. Their humoral theories offered no framework for a living body emitting the odours of a cadaver. They tried everything they could think of to combat it. Fragrant oils, often incredibly expensive and rare, were burned in copious amounts, their sweet heavy smoke mingling grotesquely with the underlying foulness. Bunches of herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, were hung throughout the chambers, their dry leaves offering little more than a futile gesture against the overwhelming tide of putrescence. Even strong vinegar was used, its sharp, acidic scent intended to cut through the reek, but it only created a new, equally unpleasant olfactory assault. It was a constant battle against an invisible, all-encompassing enemy, and the enemy was winning. This constant, undeniable smell was a crucial, quirky tidbit that underscored the unique horror of Philip's case. Unlike many illnesses that confine their devastation to the internal body, Philip's affliction was public, an assault on the senses of everyone who came near him. It was a profound violation of the king's sacred space, his chambers, which should have been a sanctuary of power and dignity, transformed into a miasma of decay. It's almost like the king's body was a giant billboard screaming, "Help! I'm rotting!" to anyone within smelling distance. This public aspect of his decline stripped him of much of his dignity, reducing him from an awe-inspiring monarch to a pitiable, repellent figure in the eyes of many. The effect on the royal staff was profound. The valets, chambermaids, and personal attendants who were constantly in the king's proximity suffered greatly. They performed their duties with stoic professionalism, but the physical toll was immense. Headaches, nausea, and a general feeling of malaise became common among them. Some fell ill themselves, though whether from the constant exposure to the noxious fumes or simply from the psychological stress, historians still argue. The king's pages, often young boys from noble families, were particularly affected, sometimes needing to be replaced as they struggled to cope with the revolting conditions. Loyalty was stretched to its breaking point, and only the most dedicated, or those with the strongest stomachs, could remain by his side for extended periods. For Philip himself, the odour must have been a constant, torturous reminder of his horrifying condition. He could not escape it. It was his own body betraying him, broadcasting his internal dissolution to the world. He was living within his own tomb, a prisoner in a decaying flesh prison. Imagine the psychological torment of being constantly aware of your own putrefaction, of knowing that your very presence repels others, even those who love you. This constant sensory input, combined with the pain and itching, must have driven him to the brink of madness at times. He would try to distract himself, perhaps by having books read to him or listening to quiet music, but the smell was always there, an inescapable phantom. The spread of these whispers, fueled by the undeniable odour, had significant social and political ramifications. The authority of a monarch, especially in this era, was often tied to their physical vitality and divinely appointed health. A sick king was a vulnerable king, and a king who smelled of death while still alive was an anomaly that challenged the very fabric of their understanding of monarchy. Public morale suffered, and there were quiet murmurings among the populace about ill omens and the displeasure of God. This widespread anxiety was a mainstream historical fact, illustrating how a king's personal affliction could ripple outwards to affect the entire kingdom. The perception of the king's power began to erode. While none dared openly question his divine right to rule, the visible signs of his decay certainly cast a shadow over his effectiveness. How could a king so physically compromised inspire confidence in his armies or command respect from foreign potentates? The smell, more than any other single symptom, made his illness undeniable and public, forcing even the most optimistic to confront the grim reality. It was a public health crisis in miniature, confined to the royal person, but with immense symbolic weight. This situation also highlighted the limitations of medical science. The king's physicians, despite their high standing and access to the best available treatments, were utterly helpless. They could explain common fevers, broken bones, or even some chronic conditions, but this was beyond their ken. It pushed them to the very edge of their knowledge, forcing them to confront the terrifying prospect that some diseases simply defied their understanding. This intellectual crisis, though unstated in explicit terms, was a profound undercurrent in their desperate consultations. They were caught between their professional duty to heal and the stark reality of their impotence. The phenomenon of a living, breathing person emitting the odour of decomposition is rare, even by modern medical standards, and usually indicates a severe systemic infection or necrosis of tissue. For Philip, it likely pointed to an extensive internal breakdown, perhaps widespread gangrene or an abscess that was constantly weeping and putrefying, with the volatile organic compounds of decay being exhaled or diffused through his skin. The sheer volume and persistence of the smell suggest a truly massive and ongoing necrotic process. It was not merely a symptom, it was the defining characteristic of his torment, a constant sickening affirmation of his body's slow, horrifying demise. In the midst of this all, one can imagine the psychological resilience Philip must have possessed to continue functioning, however imperfectly. To live with such an affliction, to be constantly aware of the revulsion you inspire, to be assaulted by the smell of your own decay, it is a level of suffering almost unimaginable. He was truly isolated by his illness, not just from the usual courtly pleasantries, but from the very human comfort of touch and proximity. The king's chamber, once a beacon of power, became a chamber of horrors, its air thick with dread and the undeniable scent of death. The lingering questions about the specific origin of the odour contribute to the open scholarly debate surrounding Philip's case. Was it a specific bacterial infection, a breakdown of internal organs, the result of multiple complications from an underlying disease? Modern medical science, with its understanding of microbiology and pathology, can offer educated guesses, but without precise historical documentation or surviving tissues, the exact mechanism remains elusive. It is a mystery shrouded in the mists of time and the overpowering stench of a king who rotted while alive. As the king's body continued its agonizing public decay, the intricate tapestry of diplomacy and statecraft began to fray. Philip II, once a formidable presence on the European stage, a monarch whose word carried immense weight, and whose strategic mind shaped alliances and ignited conflicts, was now a visibly diminished figure. His failing health became not just a personal tragedy, but a profound geopolitical vulnerability, a fact keenly observed and undoubtedly exploited by rival powers. The impact on diplomatic affairs loomed large, a dark cloud over the kingdom's future. Regular diplomatic receptions, once glittering affairs designed to impress and intimidate, became fraught with an unspoken tension. Foreign ambassadors, representatives of rival crowns and aspiring empires, would arrive at the Spanish court with their carefully crafted messages and demands, only to be confronted by the stark reality of the king's decline. Audiences with Philip, once coveted opportunities for direct influence, transformed into uncomfortable encounters. The king, propped on pillows, his face gaunt and discoloured, his voice often a strained whisper, was a shadow of his former self. The omnipresent odour, the one constant companion to the king's decay, filled the opulent chambers, making even brief encounters an ordeal. It was difficult to project an image of unwavering power when the very air around the sovereign reeked of dissolution. Consider the ambassador from France, perhaps, or England, arriving with a crucial treaty proposal or a declaration of intent. They would be led through increasingly hushed corridors, past courtiers with subtly averted gazes, into a chamber where the very atmosphere was oppressive. To negotiate with a king who was visibly rotting, whose attention might flicker, whose pain was evident in every strained breath, was a unique challenge. Such observations would be meticulously reported back to their own monarchs, painting a picture not of strength, but of a kingdom on the precipice of uncertainty. This decline in his physical presence directly translated into a perceived weakening of his diplomatic standing. It's like a CEO trying to close $1 billion deal while simultaneously battling a severe case of the flu and smelling faintly of expired milk, not exactly confidence-inspiring. The king's capacity for sustained work, a hallmark of his reign, diminished significantly. Long periods of concentration, essential for reviewing complex treaties, drafting detailed instructions to viceroys, or strategizing military campaigns, became impossible. He would dictate letters from his sickbed, but his energy would flag, his thoughts sometimes wandering amidst the pain and fever. Ministers found themselves in the unenviable position of having to interpret vague directives or fill in the blanks where the king's focus had lapsed. This created an administrative bottleneck, slowing the machinery of government at a time when rapid decisions were often crucial. Foreign policy, therefore, suffered. Alliances that required constant negotiation and reassuring presence began to waver. Treaties that demanded careful, subtle diplomacy languished. Rivals, sensing weakness, grew bolder in their demands or in their incursions into territories claimed by Spain. The intricate dance of European politics relied heavily on the personal dynamism and perceived strength of its monarchs. A king who was visibly decaying undermined this fundamental pillar of international relations. This vulnerability was a mainstream historical fact that destabilized the European balance of power, creating ripples of anxiety and opportunity across the continent. One quirky tidbit illustrates the sheer lengths to which the court went to maintain an illusion of normalcy. On occasion, even as his condition worsened, elaborate processions or courtly events were still planned, with the king making brief, highly choreographed appearances. He would be heavily supported, his face carefully made up to disguise the pallor and lesions, his movements agonizingly slow. These public displays were meant to project an image of continued health and vigour, a desperate attempt to reassure the populace and foreign observers. However, the effort involved for the king was immense, and the careful staging often betrayed the reality, as his exhaustion and discomfort would be palpable despite the elaborate charade. It was like trying to patch a gaping hole in a ship with a piece of lace. The effort was visible, but the underlying damage remained glaringly obvious. The strain on the king's inner circle was immense. His most loyal advisers found themselves burdened with an unprecedented weight of responsibility. They had to manage the day-to-day affairs of a vast empire, often without clear guidance from the ailing monarch. They also had to deal with the increasingly frantic demands of the royal physicians, the growing anxiety of the royal family and the ever-present political manoeuvring of ambitious courtiers. Their diplomatic missions became more challenging as foreign courts, fully aware of Philip's dire condition, sought to extract concessions or exploit perceived weaknesses. They were constantly putting out fires, both literally from the numerous censers and candles used to combat the smell, and metaphorically in the unstable political landscape. Even military campaigns, which were often initiated or commanded by the king himself, felt the impact. Orders might be delayed, strategic decisions might lack the usual clarity, and the morale of the armed forces could be affected by the knowledge that their supreme commander was slowly rotting away. While competent generals could continue to lead in the field, the ultimate source of authority and strategic vision was compromised. The entire chain of command, from the lowest soldier to the highest-ranking general, relied on the strength and decisiveness of the monarch. When that strength wavered, the entire structure felt it. The most profound open scholarly debate regarding this period revolves around the extent to which Philip's physical decline directly influenced specific diplomatic failures or military setbacks. While it's clear his health was a significant factor, discerning direct causal links for every decision or outcome is complex. Did certain rivalries intensify specifically because of his illness, or were they already brewing and merely accelerated by his vulnerability? Historians still grapple with separating the effects of a long-standing geopolitical climate from the immediate impact of the king's shocking physical deterioration. It's a chicken and egg situation, only with more festering. The king's personal dignity suffered immensely in the diplomatic arena. Philip, a man who prided himself on his control and his formidable intellect, was now often seen in a state of diminished capacity. He might struggle to follow complex arguments, his replies might be terse or delayed, and his very appearance was a source of discomfort. It was a profound and public humiliation for a man who had always commanded absolute respect. He was forced to continue performing his kingly duties even as his body betrayed him in the most grotesque fashion imaginable, a living spectacle of suffering that few could bear to witness for long. Moreover, the sheer logistical challenge of receiving foreign dignitaries in a chamber permeated by the scent of decay was immense. Courtiers would try to usher them in and out as quickly as possible to minimise their exposure. The king's attendants would be constantly preparing the room, burning more incense, dousing surfaces with more vinegar, in a futile attempt to make the air bearable. It was a desperate Sisyphean task, as the source of the odour remained the king himself. This constant struggle against the smell served as a tangible manifestation of the kingdom's struggle against the king's decline. The long-term effects of this diplomatic weakening were significant. Successors would inherit not only a vast empire but also the consequences of a period of international uncertainty and perhaps even aggression stemming from the last years of Philip's reign. The perception of the Spanish crown's strength, built over decades of conquest and careful statecraft, was undeniably tarnished by the spectacle of its ailing monarch. It was a reminder to all of Europe of the fragility of even the greatest powers when their very head was consumed by an unknown and horrifying malady. The king's body, rotting in state, became a grim metaphor for the perceived decline of his empire, with the conventional medical wisdom of the era proving utterly useless against Philip II's horrifying ailment. The royal physicians, driven by desperation and the immense pressure of their positions, began to cast their net wider, embracing an increasingly bizarre and often terrifying array of remedies. The polite adherence to Galenic principles gave way to frantic experimentation, as the doctors delved into ancient lore, alchemical texts and folk remedies, hoping that some forgotten, obscure cure might halt the king's relentless decay. It was a race against time, with the king's body dissolving before their very eyes, and the desperation palpable in every whispered consultation. One of the more extreme measures involved the application of substances derived from animals. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? While not quite on that level of eccentricity, the physicians explored remedies like poultices made from pigeon droppings, believed by some to draw out toxins, or the blood of young goats, sometimes applied directly to the skin lesions or even, in some accounts, mixed into draughts for ingestion. The idea behind these remedies often stemmed from sympathetic magic, or the belief that the vital force of a healthy animal could somehow transfer to the ailing human. It's like trying to jumpstart a car with a bicycle pump. Well-intentioned, but ultimately futile. Then there were the concoctions involving precious metals and minerals. Gold, in powdered form or as leaf, was frequently prescribed, not just for kings, but for many wealthy patients. It was believed to possess inherent purity and incorruptibility, and therefore, ingesting it might transfer these qualities to the decaying body. The irony of attempting to halt decay with a substance prized for not decaying was likely lost on the physicians. Silver, too, was sometimes used, believed to have cleansing properties. Quicksilver, or mercury, a highly toxic substance, was occasionally employed in minute quantities, particularly for skin ailments, though its long-term effects were devastating. The use of these exotic and dangerous elements underscores the profound lack of understanding regarding the human body's chemistry and the true nature of disease. The world of alchemy, a blend of early chemistry, philosophy and mysticism, also offered tantalizing, if ultimately dangerous, solutions. Alchemists, often viewed with a mixture of awe and suspicion, promised elixirs of life, universal panaceas, and tinctures that could purify the body. While the royal physicians might have maintained a professional distance from outright alchemists, they would certainly have considered remedies derived from alchemical principles, or those claiming alchemical purity. These would involve complex distillations, calcifications, and purifications of various substances, often with incredibly precise instructions that bordered on ritual. It's a mainstream historical fact that alchemy and medicine were far from distinct disciplines in this era, with many respected physicians dabbling in alchemical practices. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes surfaces in discussions of such cases involved mummy dust. Yes, you heard that right. Powdered remains of Egyptian mummies, believed to possess ancient healing powers and the essence of long life, were occasionally prescribed and ingested by desperate patients, including royalty. The macabre thought of a king who was literally rotting being given the dust of someone who had been dead for thousands of years in the hope of a cure is a testament to the sheer desperation of the age. One can only imagine the bitter taste and the even bitterer irony. Beyond ingestion and external application, more ritualistic or spiritual approaches were also considered, reflecting the deeply religious nature of the time. Prayers, pilgrimages, often performed by proxy if the king was too ill, and the touching of holy relics were all employed. While not strictly medical, these practices were seen as integral to healing, addressing the spiritual aspect of illness. Bishops and priests would visit the king, administering last rites on multiple occasions as his condition worsened, preparing his soul for the inevitable, even as the physicians continued their futile battle to save his body. This blend of the sacred and the scientific, however limited, was characteristic of the era's approach to health and death. The king endured all of these desperate measures with a stoicism born of profound suffering and a faint glimmer of hope. He swallowed bitter potions, allowed his veins to be opened, and tolerated the application of foul-smelling poultices. He subjected himself to these indignities because ultimately he wished to live, and his physicians were the only ones offering even the slimmest chance of relief. Yet, each new treatment failed, each new concoction offered no respite, and each passing day saw him sink further into the abyss of decay. This period of desperate remedies also highlights an open scholarly debate. To what extent did these extreme treatments hasten the king's decline? While the underlying disease was undoubtedly fatal, it is plausible that the aggressive bleedings, purges, and the ingestion of potentially toxic substances, like mercury or other heavy metals present in some alchemical preparations, severely weakened his already compromised system, contributing to his dehydration, malnutrition, and overall physical collapse. Did the cure in its desperate pursuit accelerate the disease? It's a chilling thought, but one that many modern historians and medical experts ponder. The psychological toll on the king during these constant interventions must have been immense. Not only was he experiencing unimaginable physical agony, but he was also subjected to a relentless barrage of uncomfortable and often painful procedures. His body was no longer his own. It was a battleground where desperate doctors waged a losing war against an unknown enemy. The lack of privacy, the constant scrutiny of his bodily functions, and the endless parade of new, strange treatments must have been a profound humiliation for a man of his stature. He was stripped bare, both literally and metaphorically, by his illness. As the king's body continued its putrefaction, the very air of his sick room became a laboratory of failed experiments and desperate hope. The discarded remnants of poultices, the lingering odours of various distillations, and the omnipresent stench of decay mingled to create an environment that must have been almost unbearable. The physicians, despite their failures, pressed on, their faces etched with exhaustion and frustration. Their reputations, their very livelihoods depended on finding a solution, and the pressure must have been enormous. They were trapped in a cycle of trying, failing, and then trying something even more outlandish. The entire episode serves as a stark reminder of the limitations of medicine prior to the scientific revolution. Without a germ theory, without an understanding of cellular pathology, without sterile techniques or effective analgesics, physicians were essentially working in the dark, relying on millennia-old theories that were often more philosophical than empirical. The sight of a king, a symbol of divine health and power, succumbing to such a gruesome, inexplicable decay must have been a profoundly unsettling experience for everyone involved. Underscoring the arbitrary and often brutal nature of disease, in an age before modern medicine. It was a terrifying glimpse into a world where even the most powerful individuals were utterly at the mercy of their own biological frailties, with no real hope of intervention. The king's body, once a robust vessel of power, was now engaged in a horrifying, irreversible process of self-dismantlement. The initial vague symptoms had escalated into a full-blown spectacle of physical decay, a gruesome gambit played out in the royal chambers. The process was relentless, manifesting in increasingly shocking ways that defied all known medical understanding of the age. It was not merely an illness, it was a living dissolution, a slow-motion unravelling of flesh and form. The most prominent and distressing manifestations of this internal corruption were the skin lesions. What began as small, irritating rashes and persistent itching had transformed into widespread festering sores. These weren't just superficial irritations, they were deep, angry wounds, some weeping pus, others crusted over with dried exudate. They appeared on various parts of his body seemingly at random, then coalesced into larger, more disfiguring patches. The skin, instead of being a protective barrier, had become a canvas for his internal disintegration, reflecting the horror within. Imagine watching someone's skin erupt in a myriad of painful, non-healing wounds, day after agonizing day. It's truly the stuff of nightmares, and it was the king's waking reality. Beyond the visible lesions, there was evidence of tissue necrosis. This is where parts of the living tissue actually die and begin to rot. The odour, which had become so pervasive, was a direct consequence of this process. The volatile compounds released by decaying flesh. The physicians, with their limited knowledge of pathology, might have observed darkened areas of skin that were cold to the touch, or areas that seemed to slough off, but they would have been utterly baffled by the underlying mechanism. Today, we understand necrosis as the irreversible death of cells and tissues, often due to lack of blood supply, infection, or trauma. For Philip, it seemed to be a systemic, internal process, leading to the horrifying conclusion that his body was quite literally rotting alive. The king's extremities, particularly his hands and feet, would have been particularly vulnerable to this kind of decay. Reduced circulation, combined with the overall debilitation of his body, could lead to gangrene, a form of necrosis caused by a lack of blood flow and often complicated by bacterial infection. If parts of his fingers or toes became necrotic, they would turn black, cold, and eventually dry out and fall off, or become soft and putrid. This is a truly gruesome possibility that fits the description of rotting alive. A particularly unsettling quirky tidbit from the historical periphery of royal ailments involves the fear of saint's fire or ergotism, a fungal infection that could cause gangrene of the extremities, though this typically came from contaminated rye and affected large populations, not singular monarchs. However, the symptoms of necrotic extremities would have evoked similar dread. The impact of this internal decay was not limited to visible skin. It likely affected his internal organs as well. His persistent fever, for instance, could have been a constant battle against systemic infection, as bacteria from the necrotic tissues spread through his bloodstream. His increasing weakness, loss of appetite, and organ dysfunction would all be consistent with widespread internal putrefaction. The liver, kidneys, and lungs would gradually fail, unable to cope with the burden of pervasive infection and tissue breakdown. This internal battle, hidden from plain sight but evidenced by the terrible smell and his declining vital functions, was far more insidious than the visible skin lesions. The king's pain during this period must have been excruciating and constant. The lesions would have been raw and agonizingly tender. The internal decay would have caused deep, visceral pain, and the incessant itching, often a precursor to skin breakdown, would have offered no respite. Sleep would have been a near impossibility, punctuated by sharp pangs of pain, overwhelming discomfort, and the constant awareness of his own body's disintegration. Pain management, in the 16th century, was rudimentary at best, limited largely to opium-based concoctions that often induced more stupor than true relief. He was trapped in a living nightmare, every nerve ending screaming in agony. As the physical decay advanced, Philip's voice, once strong and authoritative, became a mere rasp, barely audible even to those leaning close. His once commanding presence dwindled to a skeletal frame, his eyes sunken and haunted. The royal bed, once a symbol of his regal power, became a cage of suffering, from which he could only observe the slow, terrifying end of his physical being. The contrast between the grandeur of his surroundings and the horrifying reality of his body's collapse was stark and profoundly tragic. It was a king, surrounded by opulence, yet reduced to the most basic visceral struggle for existence. This physical deterioration was a mainstream historical fact that deeply impacted the court and kingdom. The court physicians, utterly at a loss, continued their desperate interventions, but their efforts were akin to rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship. They applied more poultices to the festering sores, administered stronger purges, and bled the king more frequently, all while the underlying process of decay continued unabated. They were trying to address the symptoms without understanding the root cause, like constantly mopping up water from a broken pipe without ever turning off the tap. The sheer horror of witnessing this decline must have left an indelible mark on all who were present. The king's family, his children, would have borne witness to their father's agonizing transformation, a sight that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The loyal attendants, forced to tend to a body that was increasingly repulsive, performed their duties with a grim fortitude born of duty and a deep, unspoken sorrow. The palace, once a centre of life and power, became a macabre hospice, its halls filled with the scent of death. An open, scholarly debate surrounds the exact medical diagnosis of Philip II. While descriptions point strongly towards a systemic necrotic process, possibly exacerbated by severe infection, the precise underlying cause remains elusive. Was it a rare form of leprosy, though the descriptions don't perfectly align? A virulent strain of erysipelas, or another bacterial infection that spread unchecked? A particularly aggressive form of an autoimmune disorder leading to widespread tissue death? Or perhaps a combination of factors, a perfect storm of disease and medieval medical impotence? Without detailed historical autopsies or preserved tissue samples that could be analysed with modern forensic science, the true medical name for the king who rotted alive remains a subject of informed speculation and ongoing historical detective work. It's like trying to solve a cold case with only circumstantial evidence and faded memories. The gruesome nature of his illness also served as a powerful, albeit morbid, reminder of human mortality, even for those at the very pinnacle of power. The king, who commanded armies and dictated the fate of nations, was ultimately powerless against the forces of decay within his own body. It was a humbling and terrifying spectacle for all who witnessed it, a stark illustration of the fragility of life and the inevitability of death, even for those anointed by God. The scent of his decay, the sight of his lesions, became a constant, visceral memento mori for his entire court. He was, in his final years, a living, breathing testament to the impermanence of all things, even kings. As the horrifying physical decay of Philip II advanced, stripping him of his vigour and dignity, a palpable tremor ran through the court. The question of succession, always a sensitive undercurrent in any monarchy, now surged to the forefront, casting a long, anxious shadow over the palace. The king's evident decline ignited a scramble among factions, each vying for influence, each scrutinising the potential heirs and their own positions in the inevitable new order. The once tightly controlled political landscape began to fracture, revealing the raw ambition and simmering tensions beneath the polished veneer of courtly decorum. Philip's health, a barometer of the kingdom's stability, had plummeted to such a precarious state that the concept of a smooth, orderly transition seemed increasingly uncertain. The fear was not just of the king's death, but of the manner of his death, a slow public decay that suggested divine displeasure or a profound vulnerability. This unique and grotesque end created a climate of instability, raising questions about the legitimacy and strength of the line that would follow. It's like watching a mighty oak tree slowly wither and rot from the inside out. The concern isn't just for the tree, but for the entire ecosystem it supports. The primary concern, of course, revolved around the king's direct heir. In most monarchies, the line of succession is clear, but a long, debilitating illness introduces complications. How long would the interregnum last? Would the heir be perceived as strong enough to take the reins of a kingdom potentially weakened by its monarch's lingering illness? And perhaps most importantly, would the transition be peaceful, or would the king's drawn-out agony invite challenges from within or without? These were the anxieties that gnawed at the hearts of courtiers and high-ranking officials. The court became a theatre of subtle manoeuvring and veiled alliances. Noble families, sensing the impending shift in power, began to position themselves strategically. Those who had been out of favour under Philip's long reign saw an opportunity for resurgence. Those who enjoyed the king's trust now faced the challenge of ensuring their continued influence under a new monarch. Whispers about the character and capabilities of the heir grew louder, scrutinising every aspect of their education, their temperament, and their perceived allegiances. It was a dangerous game, requiring acute political antennae and a willingness to back the right horse before the race was fully run. This intense focus on the heir was a mainstream historical fact, common to all royal courts when a monarch's health failed. However, in Philip's case, the nature of his illness added a unique layer of macabre anxiety. A sudden death, though tragic, usually led to a swift succession. His slow, visible decay, however, prolonged the period of uncertainty, allowing ample time for factions to coalesce and for anxieties to fester. The longer he suffered, the more pronounced the political instability became. The king himself, in his lucid moments, would have been acutely aware of this unspoken tension. He had spent his life safeguarding his dynasty and the future of his kingdom. To see it now, even as he lay dying, being subtly undermined by his own physical collapse, must have been a source of immense personal anguish. He would try, with what little energy he had left, to ensure a smooth transition, perhaps issuing last-minute decrees or consolidating power around his designated heir. But his ability to exert authority was severely compromised by his physical state, and his efforts were often undermined by the very reality of his putrefying body. A quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes emerges from this period is the idea that the king's rotting body was seen by some superstitious elements of the court as a bad omen for the entire dynasty, a physical manifestation of a curse upon the royal line. While dismissed by the rational elite, such fears could nonetheless stir unrest among the common populace and provide fertile ground for those wishing to sow discontent. The very visible, repugnant nature of his illness fueled such dark imaginings. It was as if his body was a decaying oracle, forecasting a grim future. The Queen and other close family members found themselves caught in an agonising bind. They grieved for the suffering king, yet they also had to protect the interests of the heir and ensure the continuity of the monarchy. They would have borne the brunt of both the king's personal anguish and the political machinations of the court. Their lives became a constant tightrope walk between private sorrow and public duty, all played out against the backdrop of an unbearable stench and the king's gruesome decay. The question of regency also arose if the heir was a minor or deemed too inexperienced. Would a council of regents be established? Who would lead it? Such decisions carried immense political weight and could lead to fierce power struggles. While Philip's heir was of age, the sheer debilitation of the king meant that de facto regents, high-ranking ministers and family members, were already exercising considerable power in the king's name, adding another layer of complexity to the succession. This gradual shift of power, often imperceptible to outsiders, was acutely felt within the palace. The nobility's loyalty was tested. While most would remain outwardly faithful to the dying king, their deeper allegiances began to drift towards the rising sun of the future monarch. Private meetings, discreet correspondence, and subtle gestures of allegiance became commonplace. Courtiers became masters of reading the subtle cues, the slight nod, the prolonged gaze, that indicated who was gaining favour and who was losing it. The palace, once a theatre of ceremonial grandeur, became a silent battlefield of political ambition. There is an open, scholarly debate about the degree to which Philip's prolonged illness and the visible decay influenced the policies and decisions made by his ministers in his final years. Did they take bolder actions, knowing the king's oversight was limited? Did they postpone critical decisions, fearing he lacked the capacity to give sound counsel? Or did they continue to operate largely as before, trying to maintain stability in a turbulent period? Disentangling the genuine administrative needs from the opportunism fueled by the king's illness remains a complex challenge for historians. It's like trying to discern who truly made the calls when the CEO is on life support. Was it the board, or the ambitious executive VP just signing his name? The international implications of the succession scramble were also significant. Foreign powers, as mentioned, keenly observed the instability within the Spanish court. They might initiate diplomatic overtures to the perceived heir, or conversely, take advantage of the internal disarray to press their own territorial claims or political agendas. The uncertainty surrounding Philip's succession offered a window of opportunity for rivals and a period of vulnerability for Spain. The lingering illness of a monarch, particularly one as powerful as Philip, sent ripples of anxiety and strategic recalculation across all the royal courts of Europe. In essence, Philip's slow physical decay mirrored a slower yet equally profound political decay. The vitality of the monarchy, intertwined with the vitality of the monarch, was visibly draining away. The scramble for succession was not just about who would sit on the throne, but about the very nature of power itself, in a kingdom where the king's body was a ghastly reminder of human frailty. The spectacle of the king rotting alive was not just a medical tragedy, it was a political catalyst, accelerating a period of intense uncertainty and realignment within one of Europe's most powerful empires. As Philip II lay increasingly consumed by his horrific ailment, the power dynamics within the Spanish court began a subtle yet inexorable shift. The reins of power, once held firmly in the king's formidable grasp, now slipped, imperceptibly at first, into the hands of key figures around him. This wasn't a sudden coup or a dramatic seizure of authority, but rather an organic, almost inevitable consequence of the monarch's physical decline. The court, ever a sensitive barometer of royal health, began to respond to the vacuum, with ambitious courtiers and trusted advisers stepping into the breach, consciously or unconsciously. It was like watching a once mighty river begin to meander into new, smaller tributaries as its main course dried up. At the forefront of this shifting landscape were the king's closest confidants and the most powerful members of his council. These were men who had served Philip for years, intimately familiar with the machinery of government and the king's preferred methods. Now, with the king often too weak to hold full audiences or give clear, sustained directives, they found themselves making more decisions independently, interpreting his occasional whispers, or acting on his implied wishes. This incremental assumption of authority was driven by necessity. The empire still needed to be governed, laws still needed to be enforced, and diplomatic relations still needed to be managed. The empire, after all, couldn't simply put itself on pause while its monarch rotted. The queen, often a figure of solace and quiet strength, also gained a new, albeit tragic, prominence. She became the primary gatekeeper to the king, managing access to his sickbed, mediating between the desperate physicians and the anxious ministers. Her proximity to the ailing monarch gave her immense, if informal, power. She would be the one to convey his wishes, to soothe his discomfort, and to act as a crucial link between the suffering king and the outside world. Her role transformed from consort to a vital, if reluctant, bridge, bearing the immense emotional and administrative burden. The most powerful ministers, particularly those in charge of state affairs, finance and the military, saw their influence grow exponentially. Decisions that once required the king's direct assent were now often made by these grandees, with only a pro forma approval from the bedridden monarch, if at all. This decentralisation of power, while necessary, also opened the door to greater factionalism and potential self-interest. Each minister, naturally, began to prioritise their own department's agenda, and with the ultimate authority weakened, the coherence of state policy could suffer. It's a bit like an orchestra losing its conductor. The individual sections might still play, but the harmony and direction start to fall apart. A mainstream historical fact regarding this period is the increasing prominence of figures like Francisco de Sandoval y Rojas, Duke of Lerma, who, though not yet the all-powerful valido he would become under Philip III, began to exert considerable influence in the king's later years. While some historical accounts suggest Philip II retained a firm grip on power until his last breath, the overwhelming evidence of his physical state points to a practical necessity for others to step into the administrative void. The debate then centres not on if power shifted, but how much and to whom. The palace, once a rigid hierarchy centred entirely on the king, began to loosen. Courtiers who had previously been peripheral figures now found opportunities to gain favour by aligning themselves with rising powers within the administration. Loyalties, once directed solely at the monarch, subtly began to diversify, with ambitious individuals hedging their bets and cultivating relationships with potential future leaders. The whispers about succession, once confined to hushed corners, now became more open, albeit still carefully veiled. Everyone was watching, calculating and positioning. The increasing reliance on the Duke of Lerma in particular highlights a quirky or fringe tidbit in how power transitions, even informal ones, occurred. Lerma, known for his administrative acumen and shrewd political instincts, understood the power of proximity to the ailing king. He effectively managed access, filtered information, and became indispensable in the daily running of the court. His ability to interpret the king's weakened commands and translate them into actionable policy gave him enormous leverage. It was not unlike a diligent personal assistant slowly becoming the de facto decision-maker for a severely incapacitated CEO. His influence grew not through overt usurpation, but through sheer necessity and skillful opportunism. This informal transfer of power was delicate. No one dared to openly challenge the king's authority or suggest that he was no longer capable. Such a declaration would be tantamount to treason. Instead, the process was one of gradual absorption, with responsibilities naturally flowing to those who could still perform them. The ministers would present decisions as the king's will, even if that will had been weakly assented to, or even merely inferred from his pain-racked expressions. The facade of absolute royal control was maintained, even as the reality beneath it rapidly eroded. The king himself, in moments of lucidity, must have observed this shift, with a mixture of resignation and perhaps even a hint of relief. While his pride would undoubtedly suffer from his diminished capacity, the immense burden of governing a vast empire while his body was actively disintegrating must have been overwhelming. Perhaps there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken acknowledgement between the king and his most trusted advisors that they must carry the torch even as his own light dimmed. It's like a marathon runner, nearing collapse, silently handing the baton to a teammate. The logistical challenges of this period amplified the shift. With the king confined to his chambers, official documents, dispatches, and petitioners had to be brought to him. This created a new layer of bureaucracy and gatekeeping. Those who controlled access to the king, who decided what information reached him and in what form, wielded significant power. This informal control over the flow of information allowed certain individuals to shape the king's perception of events, even as his grip on reality became tenuous due to pain and illness. An open scholarly debate concerns the true extent of Philip II's cognitive faculties in his final months. While his physical decay is well documented, historians continue to debate how much of his famed intellect and decisiveness remained intact amidst the pain, fever, and probable sepsis. Was he truly directing policy, however weakly, or were his ministers largely acting on their own initiative, merely seeking his nominal approval? Distinguishing between genuine royal command and the interpreted will of a suffering monarch is a formidable challenge, relying heavily on the subjective accounts of those around him. It's a bit like trying to read tea leaves, only the tea is exceptionally murky. The weakening of the central authority had ripple effects across the empire. Provincial governors, viceroys in the distant colonies, and military commanders on far-flung frontiers all relied on clear, decisive orders from the crown. When those orders became infrequent or ambiguous, they were forced to act with greater autonomy, sometimes leading to inconsistencies in policy or even outright defiance. The king's physical decay thus manifested as a subtle but growing administrative fragmentation across his vast domains. Ultimately, the transformation of power during Philip II's final illness was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the state, even in the face of its sovereign's horrifying decline. While the king's body rotted, the machinery of governance, however imperfectly, continued to function. It was a messy, undignified, and often frightening process, but one that ensured the continuity of the monarchy. The king's slow death became a crucible for the emergence of new centres of power, setting the stage for the reign of his successor and the next chapter in Spanish history. The court became a masterclass in political survival, where the art of influence was perfected amidst the overwhelming scent of decay. The final act of Philip II's agonising drama was a descent into an abyss of escalating pain, relentless fevers, and the complete fading of any hope. What had begun as a baffling malaise had now culminated in a state of extreme bodily dissolution, a living nightmare that stretched over several harrowing weeks, perhaps even months, marking the grim finale of his long reign. The initial symptoms of vague aches and subtle odours had metastasized into an overwhelming systemic collapse, leaving the king a mere husk of his former self, consumed by the very process of putrefaction. The fevers, once intermittent, now raged almost constantly, spiking to terrifying heights, then receding only to return with renewed ferocity. These fevers were a testament to the internal battle being waged, likely against widespread infection born from the necrotic tissues. His body was a furnace of inflammation, constantly burning, yet paradoxically parts of him felt cold to the touch as circulation failed. He would shiver uncontrollably even in the oppressive summer heat, then sweat profusely, leaving him drenched and utterly exhausted. The attending physicians, though still clinging to their ancient theories, recognized these fevers as a clear sign of the body's losing struggle against an overwhelming unseen force. They packed him in cooling cloths, or conversely piled blankets on him, in a futile attempt to regulate a temperature that defied their every effort. The pain, which had been a constant companion, now intensified to an unbearable degree. The widespread skin lesions, which by this point would have covered much of his body, became deeper, more extensive, and incredibly sensitive. Every movement, every shift in position, every touch, no matter how gentle, would send searing agony through his emaciated frame. The internal decay, the rotting of tissues and possibly organs, would have contributed a deep, gnawing pain that no amount of opium could truly dull. His moans and cries, usually stifled by his royal dignity, would sometimes escape, filling the chambers with the sounds of pure, unadulterated suffering. It was a heartbreaking testament to the limits of human endurance. His once sharp mind, though remarkably resilient for much of his illness, now began to succumb to the cumulative effects of pain, fever, and probable sepsis. Moments of lucidity became rarer, interspersed with long periods of delirium. He would drift in and out of consciousness, his words sometimes coherent, sometimes nonsensical, caught in the swirling mists of his dying brain. He might speak of long-past battles, or murmur the names of long-dead relatives, his thoughts untethered from the grim reality of his present. This mental fog, while terrifying for those who loved him, might have offered him a merciful escape from the continuous torment of his body. It was like a flickering candle, offering brief bursts of light before plunging into darkness. The relentless itching, which had plagued him for so long, continued its maddening assault, even as his strength waned. His hands, now skeletal, would weakly reach to scratch, leaving new abrasions on skin already compromised by lesions. The cycle of itching, scratching, and infection was unending, contributing to the overall putrefaction. The smell, the pervasive, sickening odour of decay, remained constant, a grim and inescapable presence. Even in his delirium one might imagine the smell, a phantom tormentor clinging to his consciousness. This distinctive odour was a quirky or fringe tidbit that truly set his demise apart, a unique sensory mark on his suffering that made his final days particularly harrowing for all present. As the days blended into a continuous twilight of suffering, the hope for recovery, which had once flickered, finally extinguished itself. Even the most optimistic physicians, and certainly the most desperate, realised that their efforts were utterly futile. They continued to administer their remedies, not out of any real expectation of cure, but perhaps out of duty, habit, or a desperate wish to alleviate some measure of his pain, however small. Their faces would have been etched with exhaustion and the grim realisation of their defeat. They were witnesses to a medical mystery that defied their entire corpus of knowledge. The king's body was literally wasting away. His muscles atrophied, his flesh seemed to melt from his bones, leaving him skeletal and almost unrecognisable. His eyes, once piercing, were now sunken deep into their sockets, staring out with a vacant, haunted expression. The process of decay was so advanced that parts of his skin might have peeled away, revealing raw, weeping tissue beneath. His nails and hair, fed by a dying system, would have been brittle or discoloured. It was a truly horrifying spectacle, a slow-motion process of decomposition occurring before death itself had formally claimed him. This visible disintegration was a mainstream historical fact, albeit one often glossed over in less graphic accounts, that profoundly shocked his court and family. In his final moments, the accounts suggest a mixture of profound suffering and moments of spiritual clarity. He would receive the last rites repeatedly, surrounded by his family and the highest clergy, seeking solace in faith as his body failed him. He clutched a crucifix, his fingers too weak to hold it firmly, but his spiritual conviction for all his physical torment seemed to remain steadfast. He was facing death not as a warrior on the battlefield, but as a man utterly stripped bare, relying on faith alone. The ultimate surrender came not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow fading of the last vestiges of life. His breathing became shallow and ragged, his heartbeat weak and erratic. The cycle of fever and delirium would continue until, eventually, his body simply could no longer sustain life. The moment of death, when it finally arrived, was likely not a sudden jolt, but a gentle, almost imperceptible slipping away, a final release from the agonizing prison of his decaying flesh. The silence that followed his last breath would have been profound, broken only by the quiet sobs of those who mourned him, and, perhaps, the lingering, bitter scent of the decay that had consumed him. An open, scholarly debate surrounds the exact timing and nature of his consciousness in the very last hours. Did he experience a final moment of clarity, a flash of awareness before the end, or was his passing entirely shrouded in the merciful fog of delirium? The primary sources, often written by deeply religious chroniclers, tend to emphasize spiritual awakenings, but the physiological reality of his condition suggests that sustained consciousness would have been incredibly difficult. Historians grapple with separating pious narrative from clinical reality, trying to understand the subjective experience of a king rotting alive. His death was the culmination of a suffering so extreme that it left an indelible mark on his kingdom and on the collective memory of his court. It was a unique, horrifying end to a powerful reign, a stark reminder that even the most formidable monarchs are ultimately subject to the frailties of the human body. The king who rotted alive became a morbid legend, his passing a gruesome tale whispered through the generations, a chilling testament to the power of disease and the limitations of an age before modern medicine. The final scene was not one of glory or peaceful slumber, but of the body's ultimate horrifying surrender to dissolution. The immediate aftermath of Philip II's death was a complex tableau of profound relief, official mourning, and an urgent, if unspoken, desire to understand the incomprehensible horror that had preceded it. The suffocating pall of his prolonged gruesome illness lifted, leaving behind a silence that was almost as jarring as the stench had been pervasive. His passing, while deeply sorrowful for his family, was undoubtedly a release for all who had witnessed his agonizing decline. The air in the palace, for the first time in months, began to slowly clear of the putrid miasma, allowing courtiers and family alike to breathe a collective, if still grief-stricken, sigh of relief. But beyond the immediate emotional and atmospheric changes, there was the pressing matter of understanding what had truly happened to the king. His death was not a conventional one. It defied the known categories of illness. He hadn't succumbed to a sudden fever, a battlefield wound, or even a typical wasting disease. He had, by all accounts, rotted alive, a slow disintegration that had left his body in a state of unimaginable disfigurement. This unprecedented decay demanded an explanation, both for the sake of medical knowledge and for the psychological closure of a traumatized court. The initial attempts to understand the cause were steeped in the medical theories of the time, which, as we've seen, proved woefully inadequate. The physicians who had attended him throughout his illness, now relieved of the immediate pressure of trying to cure him, began the arduous task of piecing together a retrospective diagnosis. They would have meticulously reviewed their notes, if they kept any, detailing the progression of his symptoms, the remedies applied, and the increasingly desperate observations. Their consultations would have continued, but now with a different objective, not to save, but to explain. It was like trying to solve a crime after the fact, with the victim having provided a very long, very painful, and very confusing set of clues. The formal examination of the king's body, though not a full autopsy in the modern sense, was likely performed. This would have involved a careful external inspection, noting the extent of the lesions, the discoloration of the skin, and any other outward signs of decay. Internal examinations, if performed at all, would have been rudimentary and likely limited to large organs, given the lack of anatomical knowledge and sterile techniques. The goal would have been to find tangible evidence, something that could be pointed to as the specific cause of his extraordinary suffering. However, the advanced state of putrefaction would have made such an examination particularly challenging and likely horrifying for the medical practitioners involved. It would have been a grim task, even for those accustomed to dealing with the dead. The prevailing medical framework of the era, the humoral theory, would naturally have been the lens through which they attempted to interpret their findings. They would have sought evidence of an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Perhaps they concluded that an excess of black bile had led to internal corruption, or that a particularly virulent putrefaction of the humours had occurred. These explanations, while offering a semblance of understanding within their limited paradigm, ultimately provided little true insight into the actual biological processes at play. This application of the humoral theory was a mainstream historical fact in explaining all illnesses, even those as unusual as Philip's. Beyond the immediate medical analysis, there was also a pervasive public and courtly speculation about the cause. In an age deeply steeped in religious belief and superstition, explanations often veered into the supernatural. Was it a divine punishment for some sin, real or imagined? Was it the result of witchcraft or a curse laid upon the king or his lineage? These were common interpretations for inexplicable illnesses, particularly those affecting powerful figures. The gruesome nature of Philip's decay only fueled these darker theories, adding to the mystique and horror surrounding his demise. It's like finding a perfectly healthy tree suddenly rotting. People quickly jump to curses, not fungal infections. One quirky or fringe tidbit that may have circulated was the idea that his illness was a manifestation of the king's evil, or scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused glandular swellings, which monarchs were believed to cure by touch. While Philip's symptoms were far more severe and widespread than typical scrofula, the idea of a royal illness with a supernatural dimension could have been a way for people to grapple with its incomprehensibility. The fact that the king could not cure himself or be cured by virtue of his sacred office only added to the mystification and dread. The early attempts at understanding were also hampered by the sheer repugnance of the process. The advanced state of decay, the pervasive smell, and the horrifying disfigurement would have made objective, detailed examination incredibly difficult. The physicians, as much as they were men of science, for their time, were also human. Their revulsion and the psychological toll of witnessing such a prolonged, gruesome death would undoubtedly have influenced their ability to conduct a thorough and dispassionate post-mortem analysis. There is an open scholarly debate about the extent to which the historical accounts of his decay are embellished for dramatic effect versus clinical accuracy. While the consensus is that Philip suffered from an undeniably horrifying and putrefactive illness, the precise level of detail regarding the rotting alive aspect may have been amplified over time through oral tradition and chroniclers seeking to emphasize the uniqueness of his death. Historians meticulously sift through various accounts, comparing details and looking for consistency, to distinguish between verifiable facts and literary license. It's like separating the historical truth from the legend in a particularly grisly ghost story. The immediate goal, after the initial examination, was to prepare the king's body for burial. Given the extent of the decay, this would have been a profoundly challenging task. Embalming techniques of the time were rudimentary and often ineffective against such advanced putrefaction. The body would have been cleaned, perfumed, and dressed in regal attire, but the underlying physical disintegration would have been almost impossible to fully conceal. The rapidity with which the body had deteriorated would have presented a unique logistical challenge, requiring swift action to prevent further unpleasantness. The preparations for the royal funeral, a grand and solemn affair, would have proceeded with urgency. The king's passing marked the end of an era, and the elaborate rituals surrounding his death were crucial for reaffirming the continuity of the monarchy and the stability of the state. Despite the horrors of his final illness, the public face of the monarchy had to remain steadfast and dignified. The funeral rites would have been a carefully choreographed spectacle, designed to impress upon both domestic and foreign observers the enduring strength of the Spanish crown, even in the face of such a bizarre and tragic loss. Ultimately, these initial attempts to understand Philip II's bizarre demise served more to highlight the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge than to provide definitive answers. The king's body, in its horrifying decay, remained a mystery, a testament to a disease that defied classification and treatment. It set the stage for later generations, armed with more advanced scientific understanding, to revisit his case and attempt to unravel the enigma of the king who rotted alive, long after the immediate shock and grief had subsided. In the centuries that followed Philip II's death, as the initial shock and revulsion subsided, the bizarre nature of his demise continued to pique the curiosity of scholars and early scientists. as medical understanding slowly began its agonizingly slow crawl towards empirical observation and away from purely humoral theories, his case resurfaced periodically, prompting rudimentary scientific scrutiny. These were not the controlled, sterile investigations of a modern laboratory, but rather the speculative ponderings and limited examinations available to an evolving scientific community. The earliest post-mortem inquiries, performed in the immediate wake of his death, were, as mentioned, largely superficial. However, as anatomical knowledge slowly improved through the Renaissance and early modern period, the very concept of dissecting a human body for scientific understanding began to gain acceptance, albeit cautiously and often controversially. While a full, detailed autopsy as we know it today was still centuries away, there were incremental advancements. Early anatomists, often working with condemned criminals, began to map the internal organs, and their observations would, over time, inform the understanding of disease. For Philip II, without direct access to his remains for later, more detailed examination, the scrutiny primarily relied on the meticulous and often horrifying accounts left by his attending physicians and court chroniclers. These primary sources, though lacking in precise medical terminology by modern standards, provided a narrative of symptoms that tantalized later generations of medical thinkers. They contained descriptions of the pervasive odour, the widespread skin lesions, the internal decay, and the relentless fever, all pieces of a puzzle waiting for a more sophisticated framework to be solved. The rise of early pathological studies in the 17th and 18th centuries saw physicians moving beyond simply identifying symptoms to trying to understand the underlying structural changes within the body caused by disease. They began to correlate specific symptoms with changes observed in organs during post-mortem examinations. While Philip's body was long buried, these new insights allowed them to re-evaluate his case through a slightly more informed lens. For instance, the descriptions of his skin lesions and internal putrefaction might lead an 18th century pathologist to ponder systemic infections or organ failure in a way a 16th century physician bound by humoral theory could not. It was like finally getting a slightly clearer lens for a very blurry microscope. One mainstream historical fact is the general trend in medical history during this period: the slow but steady shift from a theoretical, philosophical understanding of disease to a more empirical, observational one. The case of Philip II, with its inexplicable and dramatic symptoms, would have served as an extreme example of the limitations of the old ways, implicitly pushing medical minds towards new avenues of inquiry. It was an anomaly that defied easy categorization, and anomalies often drive scientific progress. The lack of a clear, single cause of death, in his case, fueled continued discussion. Early pathologists might have speculated about an unusually virulent form of leprosy, or a particularly aggressive case of syphilis, both of which were known diseases with cutaneous manifestations and systemic effects, though neither perfectly matched the descriptions of rapid, pervasive internal putrefaction. They were grasping at straws, trying to fit a truly unique case into existing, albeit limited, disease models. A quirky or fringe tidbit that some early medical texts or discussions might have entertained involved the concept of spontaneous human combustion, a truly fantastical notion that gained some traction in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in sensationalized accounts. While Philip's symptoms clearly do not align with sudden combustion, the idea of a body decaying from within might have led some less rigorous thinkers to draw tenuous, morbid parallels. It speaks to the human tendency to seek extraordinary explanations for extraordinary phenomena, especially when scientific understanding is lacking. It's the medical equivalent of trying to explain a UFO sighting with fairy tales. The emerging field of microbiology, which truly began to take shape with the pioneering work of figures like Antony van Leeuwenhoek and his microscopes in the late 17th century, indirectly offered new avenues of thought, even if not directly applied to Philip's case. The discovery of animalcules, bacteria and other microorganisms, revolutionized the understanding of disease, suggesting that unseen entities could cause illness. While it would take centuries for germ theory to be fully accepted and developed, the mere concept of microscopic agents of disease would, in retrospect, provide a powerful framework for understanding illnesses like Philip's, where internal decay seemed to occur without obvious external cause. The early scientific scrutiny was also hampered by the pervasive nature of medical secrecy around royal illnesses. Detailed clinical notes, if kept, were often guarded fiercely, considered state secrets. This meant that later generations of medical historians and scientists had to rely on fragmented accounts, often filtered through the lens of court politics or religious interpretation. The absence of comprehensive, unbiased medical records is a constant frustration for anyone trying to apply modern diagnostic tools to historical figures. An open scholarly debate persists regarding the specific role of the king's immune system in his decline. While the concept of immunology was unknown, the rapid and extensive nature of his tissue necrosis suggests either an incredibly virulent pathogen that overwhelmed his defences or an underlying condition that severely compromised his immune response, making him vulnerable to opportunistic infections. Was it a primary immune disorder, or was his immune system simply unable to cope with an unprecedented bacterial onslaught? This is a question that modern medical understanding allows us to pose, but the historical data prevents us from definitively answering. The lack of detailed post-mortem records also meant that each generation of medical inquiry had to start almost from scratch, relying on the same limited pool of anecdotal evidence. There was no cumulative body of scientific data building on previous autopsies or clinical trials. Each physician, each medical school, each new enlightened century essentially took a fresh look at the case, applying their contemporary but still limited knowledge. This fragmented approach contributed to the enduring mystery of Philip's ailment. Despite these limitations, the enduring fascination with Philip II's rotting alive case ensured its survival in medical discourse. It became a morbid case study, a cautionary tale illustrating the ultimate vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals to the ravages of an unknown disease. It underscored the profound shift that was needed in medicine, a move away from abstract theories towards concrete, observable biological processes. The king's suffering, in a strange and indirect way, might have served as a silent, gruesome impetus for medical progress, pushing future generations to look deeper, to question old assumptions and to seek real, tangible answers in the intricacies of the human body. He was a living paradox, a medical enigma, and his terrible end served as a lasting puzzle for the burgeoning field of medical science. With the initial scientific scrutiny proving largely inconclusive due to the limitations of the era, the story of Philip II's bizarre death settled into a pattern of evolving theories, each attempting to grapple with the sheer incomprehensibility of a king literally rotting alive. As centuries passed, and medical knowledge slowly, often painfully advanced, new frameworks emerged, allowing for fresh interpretations of the historical accounts. These theories ranged from the purely speculative to those grounded in nascent scientific discovery, creating a fascinating, if sometimes bewildering, tapestry of medical musings. Early on, particularly in the period immediately following his death, one dominant theory, as mentioned, revolved around the humoral imbalance. Physicians would posit an overabundance of black bile, or corruption of the humours, leading to a state of putrefaction within the body. This was their default explanation for any chronic wasting disease, but in Philip's case, the visible and olfactory evidence of decay lent a terrifying, literal meaning to these abstract concepts. It was a convenient, albeit unhelpful, way to categorize something they couldn't truly understand. It was the medical equivalent of saying the spirits did it, when you couldn't explain a cough. As the understanding of anatomy improved, thanks to pioneering figures like Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, some theories began to focus on specific organ dysfunction. Perhaps his liver was diseased, leading to the jaundiced appearance and general malaise, or his kidneys failed, causing toxins to build up in his system, which might manifest as skin lesions and general systemic illness. However, the pervasive, deep-seated tissue necrosis and the overwhelming odour still presented a formidable challenge to these more localized explanations. No single organ failure seemed to account for the totality of his horrifying symptoms. The rise of the concept of contagion, even before the full development of germ theory, also influenced speculative diagnoses. Some might have considered a highly virulent and unusual form of epidemic disease, a plague that manifested in a particularly grotesque manner. However, the lack of widespread contagion within the court or population, apart from Philip himself, usually countered this theory. His illness seemed uniquely personal, not part of a broader outbreak, which was a mainstream historical fact that always puzzled those seeking a conventional diagnosis. A truly quirky or fringe tidbit that gained traction in various periods, particularly in popular rather than scholarly discourse, was the idea of slow poisoning. Given the political intrigues common to royal courts, The notion that a rival or disgruntled courtier might have administered a slow-acting poison, designed to cause a prolonged and agonizing death, was a titillating, if often unfounded, theory. Substances like arsenic or certain plant-based toxins could indeed cause chronic illness with skin manifestations, but the specific descriptions of putrefaction from within were difficult to reconcile with known poisons of the time. This theory often serves as a plot device in historical fiction, reflecting the enduring fascination with courtly skullduggery. It's the kind of theory whispered late at night, rather than debated in a medical lecture hall. The development of microscopy in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the eventual groundbreaking work of figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century that led to the full articulation of germ theory, fundamentally shifted the paradigm. With the understanding that unseen microorganisms could cause disease, the case of Philip II suddenly gained a plausible new explanation. The extensive skin lesions, the pervasive odour of putrefaction, the relentless fever, and the apparent internal decay could all be attributed to a massive systemic bacterial infection. This was a revolutionary concept that allowed future generations to look at old cases with entirely new eyes. Suddenly, the historical accounts of Philip's rotting alive made terrifying sense. A severe, unchecked infection, possibly starting in a wound or ulcer and spreading rapidly through the bloodstream, sepsis, could cause widespread tissue necrosis, gangrene, in a body with a compromised immune system. The odour would be a direct result of bacterial action on decaying tissues. The fever would be the body's attempt to fight the overwhelming infection. This shift from humoral imbalances to specific pathogens marked a seismic change in medical understanding, and it offered the first truly coherent explanation for Philip's suffering. An open scholarly debate continues regarding the specific type of infection or underlying condition that afflicted Philip. Was it a form of severe erysipelas or cellulitis that became systemic? Could it have been a highly aggressive staphylococcal or streptococcal infection? Some modern medical historians have even floated theories of obscure autoimmune disorders that could lead to widespread tissue destruction, or perhaps even a rare genetic predisposition to such decay, making him uniquely vulnerable. Without surviving tissue samples or more precise diagnostic details, the exact pathogen or underlying disease remains a matter of informed speculation. It's like having all the pieces of a puzzle but knowing some critical ones are forever missing. Another theory, gaining some traction in more recent analyses, considers the possibility of severe untreated diabetes. While diabetes was not understood in the 16th century, its symptoms can include chronic infections, slow-healing wounds, and in severe, uncontrolled cases, gangrene, particularly in the extremities, due to poor circulation and high blood sugar. These symptoms, combined with the general wasting and fatigue described, could fit some aspects of Philip's decline. However, the rapid, pervasive nature of the decay still leans towards an overwhelming acute infection. The lack of effective antibiotics, a development of the 20th century, is crucial to understanding why Philip's illness was so relentlessly fatal. Even if the physicians of his time had somehow identified a bacterial cause, they would have been powerless to stop it. Their remedies, from bleedings to poultices, would have been ineffective against the microbial onslaught and likely contributed to his weakening. This realization, from a modern perspective, adds another layer of tragedy to Philip's prolonged agony. He was suffering from something that today would likely be treatable with a simple course of medication. The evolving theories surrounding Philip II's death underscore the dynamic nature of historical interpretation, especially when viewed through the lens of scientific progress. What was once an inexplicable horror, fodder for superstitious tales, gradually transformed into a medical puzzle, then a case study illustrating the ravages of uncontrolled infection. His gruesome end, therefore, serves as a powerful historical marker, demonstrating the vast chasm between medieval medical understanding and the breakthroughs of modern science. The king who rotted alive became a morbid testament to the long, arduous journey of human knowledge in combating disease. Modern medicine, armed with centuries of accumulated knowledge, advanced diagnostic tools, and a profound understanding of microbiology and pathology, approaches the bizarre case of Philip II with a distinct advantage over his bewildered physicians. While a definitive retrospective diagnosis remains impossible without direct examination of remains, contemporary understanding allows for highly educated guesses, piecing together the historical narrative with the clinical insights of today. The symptoms, once a terrifying enigma, now fit into recognisable patterns of disease, offering plausible explanations for the king who rotted alive. The most compelling modern hypothesis points towards a severe, overwhelming systemic infection, often referred to as sepsis, leading to widespread tissue necrosis. The descriptions of Philip's persistent high fevers, the profound malaise, the rapid wasting and most crucially the pervasive putrid odour emanating from his body all align strongly with this diagnosis. Sepsis is the body's extreme response to an infection, triggering a chain reaction that can lead to tissue damage, organ failure, and death. In the absence of antibiotics or even basic sterile techniques, such an infection would have raged unchecked, consuming the body from within. It's like a fire spreading uncontrollably through a building, eventually collapsing the entire structure. The skin lesions, described as widespread and festering, would likely have been the external manifestation of this internal catastrophe. These could have been severe cellulitis, erysipelas, or even gangrenous ulcers, where the tissues themselves die and decompose. The constant itching he experienced could have led to self-inflicted wounds, providing entry points for bacteria, or perhaps it was a symptom of an underlying liver or kidney dysfunction caused by the sepsis, where toxins build up and irritate the skin. The lack of effective wound care in the 16th century would have allowed such infections to flourish, turning minor lesions into massive necrotic areas. This progression from itching to widespread lesions is a mainstream historical fact in the accounts of his illness. The putrid odour, the most striking and horrifying symptom, is a direct result of tissue necrosis and the metabolic byproducts of anaerobic bacteria. When tissues die and break down, bacteria that thrive in oxygen-deprived environments, anaerobes, produce volatile organic compounds that have a distinctly foul smell, often described as sulphurous or gangrenous. This odour would not only permeate his breath and skin, but also his excretions, explaining why it was so pervasive and impossible to mask. This is a crucial piece of evidence that strongly points to widespread tissue death. Imagine the smell of a forgotten piece of meat left in the sun for days, only it's coming from a living human. One quirky or fringe tidbit that modern medical speculation sometimes entertains, given the advanced nature of his decay, is the possibility of a rare, rapidly progressing necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacterial infection. While historically less documented with such specific widespread decay, modern understanding of its virulence makes it a terrifying, if unproven, possibility. Such an infection progresses incredibly rapidly, destroying muscle and fascia, the connective tissue surrounding muscles, leading to extensive necrosis and systemic toxicity. This could explain the rapid and pervasive nature of the rotting alive description, though it's typically more localized initially than Philip's generalized decay. Another consideration is a severely compromised immune system, perhaps due to an undiagnosed underlying condition. While the concept of autoimmune disorders was centuries away, diseases like severe inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, can, in rare cases, lead to systemic inflammation, malabsorption, and susceptibility to overwhelming infections and skin manifestations. Similarly, chronic liver disease, perhaps from an unknown viral infection or parasitic disease, could lead to jaundice, skin problems, and a compromised immune response, making him vulnerable to the overwhelming sepsis observed. The symptoms of extreme wasting, loss of appetite, and general weakness are consistent with prolonged severe illness and chronic infection, where the body's metabolic demands far exceed its intake, leading to cachexia, severe weight loss and muscle atrophy. His delirium and fluctuating consciousness would be signs of encephalopathy, where brain function is impaired due to the effects of fever, toxins from infection, and organ failure. There is an open scholarly debate as to whether a specific single illness caused all of Philip's symptoms, or if it was a cascading series of complications arising from an initial, perhaps less severe illness. For example, did a common infection escalate rapidly due to a compromised immune system, leading to sepsis and necrosis? Or was there a primary undiagnosed condition, like uncontrolled diabetes or a rare genetic disorder affecting connective tissue, that made him uniquely susceptible to such extreme decay? Without modern diagnostic tests performed at the time, this remains a compelling, yet ultimately unanswerable question. The cumulative effect of medieval medical interventions, while well-intentioned, must also be considered as a contributing factor to his decline. The repeated bleedings would have caused severe anemia and weakness. The aggressive purges would have led to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, further compromising his already struggling organs. The application of unsterile poultices and substances could have introduced new infections or exacerbated existing ones. In essence, the cures might have inadvertently accelerated his demise, adding to the body's burden. It's a tragic irony that the very attempts to save him may have hastened his end. Ultimately, modern medicine strongly points to a severe, disseminated bacterial infection, sepsis, as the primary cause of the horrifying rotting alive phenomenon. The lack of sterile environments, effective antibiotics, and a fundamental understanding of germ theory meant that once such an infection took hold, it would inevitably lead to widespread necrosis, organ failure, and a prolonged, agonizing death. Philip II's case serves as a chilling historical example of the brutal reality of disease in a pre-antibiotic era, where even the most powerful monarchs were utterly at the mercy of microscopic enemies. His suffering underscores the incredible leaps medical science has made, turning what was once a terrifying, inexplicable mystery into a recognised, if still severe, medical condition. He was a stark, living reminder of what happens when uncontrolled infection consumes a human being, a gruesome case study in the history of medicine. The legacy of Philip II, for all his political acumen and imperial ambition, is indelibly marked by the horrific manner of his death. His agonising, slow decay left an enduring imprint not only on the historical record, but also on the collective consciousness of his kingdom and beyond. It was a macabre spectacle that transcended mere physical suffering, embedding itself into the narrative of his reign and impacting perceptions of monarchy, power and mortality for generations to come. Firstly, his bizarre end certainly cemented his place in historical memory as the king who rotted alive. While other monarchs faced violent deaths or died suddenly, Philip's prolonged and public putrefaction was unique, making it a powerful and gruesome talking point. This vivid, almost legendary aspect of his demise often overshadows his actual accomplishments as a ruler. When people recall Philip II, it is often this shocking physical disintegration, rather than his strategic victories or administrative reforms, that comes to mind. It's like a movie star whose most famous role is a zombie, forever defined by that one horrifying performance. This indelible image is a mainstream historical fact that continues to define his historical persona. The impact on royal succession, though not overtly destabilising in terms of who took the throne, was nonetheless profound. The drawn-out nature of his illness meant that his successor, Philip III, inherited a court that had been under immense strain, navigating a long period of uncertainty and informal power shifts. The new king faced the challenge of re-establishing firm royal authority after a period where decision-making had necessarily become more diffuse. He also inherited a kingdom whose morale might have been subtly eroded by the spectacle of their previous monarch's suffering, and whose international standing might have been perceived as vulnerable, due to the years of his father's incapacitation. The unique nature of his illness also sparked persistent rumours and interpretations that went beyond conventional medical thought. Even after his death, the whispers of divine punishment, a curse, or even exotic poisons continued to circulate. For a king so deeply steeped in religious conviction and believed to rule by divine right, such a gruesome end could easily be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure or a test of faith. These religious and superstitious interpretations formed a quirky or fringe tidbit that persisted in popular lore, especially given the general lack of scientific understanding. It became a story whispered by firesides, a chilling tale passed down, fueling a morbid fascination with the unseen forces that could strike down even the mightiest. Furthermore, his death served as a stark reminder of the limitations of power. Philip II was arguably one of the most powerful monarchs of his age, commanding vast wealth, immense armies, and an empire that spanned the globe. Yet, in his final years, he was utterly powerless against the enemy within his own body. No amount of gold, no army, no decree could halt the inexorable process of decay. This humbling reality, witnessed by his entire court, underscored the fragility of human life and the ultimate equality of all before disease and death, a profound philosophical lesson played out on a royal stage. It was a living memento mori, a constant reminder to his courtiers that even kings return to dust. The legacy also includes the enduring medical mystery. For centuries, Philip's case has remained an intriguing, if horrifying, puzzle for medical historians. As medicine evolved, each new paradigm, from the early observational sciences to germ theory and modern pathology, offered a new lens through which to examine his symptoms. His illness became a morbid benchmark, a test case for medical theories. The detailed, if unscientific, descriptions left by his contemporaries became invaluable, allowing later generations to piece together a plausible diagnosis of sepsis and widespread necrosis, even without direct evidence. This continuous re-evaluation of his case by successive medical advancements speaks to the power of historical medical mysteries to drive intellectual curiosity. There is an open scholarly debate regarding the psychological impact of witnessing the king's decay on his immediate family and close advisors. While accounts mention their grief and distress, the long-term psychological scarring from watching a loved one, especially one held in such high esteem, slowly rot alive is difficult to quantify. Did it affect the reign of Philip III, making him more cautious or perhaps more melancholic? Did it instill a deeper sense of fatalism or piety in those who witnessed it? These are questions that delve into the subjective experience of history, difficult to answer definitively but compelling to explore. The sheer scale of suffering involved in Philip's death also contributed to a broader cultural impact, influencing art, literature, and even religious thought in subtle ways. The macabre reality of his physical decay would have seeped into the collective unconscious, perhaps fostering a greater awareness of mortality, or inspiring artistic expressions that explored themes of decay, transience, and the futility of worldly power. While not directly leading to new art movements, the pervasive image of a rotting king certainly added to the era's fascination with death and impermanence. Moreover, Philip's case served as a grim testament to the state of medical science in the 16th century. It highlighted the utter helplessness of even the most learned physicians when confronted with a complex systemic disease. It demonstrated the desperate reliance on unproven remedies and superstitious beliefs in the absence of genuine scientific understanding. In retrospect, his death, therefore, inadvertently became a powerful, albeit tragic argument for the necessity of scientific progress, for a more empirical, evidence-based approach to medicine that would eventually lead to breakthroughs like antibiotics and sterile surgery. His suffering was a potent, if unintended, catalyst for future medical inquiry. His final years, spent in agonizing physical decline, also reshaped perceptions of the royal body itself. Traditionally, the king's body was viewed as a sacred, symbolic entity, almost inseparable from the body politic. Philip's decay shattered this idealized image, presenting a very real, very human, and very vulnerable form. This demystification, born of horrific reality, contributed to a slow but significant shift in how monarchs were perceived, from semi-divine figures to flesh-and-blood individuals, albeit ones burdened with immense responsibility. Ultimately, the bizarre case of the king who rotted alive continues to captivate because it pushes the boundaries of human experience. It is a story of extreme suffering, medical helplessness, and the humbling reality of mortality. It reminds us of a time when the invisible world of microbes held terrifying sway over human life, and when even the most powerful individuals could be reduced to a state of unimaginable torment. His legacy is not just one of imperial rule, but of a unique and horrifying demise that serves as a chilling footnote in the annals of royal history, a testament to the enduring power of illness to transform a king into a legend of decay. The echoes of Philip II's agonizing, macabre demise reverberate even today, not just in the annals of medical history, but within the very stones of his final resting place. His legacy endures, inextricably linked to the horrifying process of his bodily decay, making him one of history's most morbid curiosities. The lingering questions surrounding his unclassifiable illness have captivated scholars, physicians, and morbidly curious minds for centuries, ensuring that the tale of the king who rotted alive continues to haunt the imagination. The immediate aftermath of his death, as we've explored, was marked by the desperate attempts of his physicians to make sense of the incomprehensible. But the mystery endured, passed down through court chronicles and medical texts, a persistent anomaly that defied easy categorization. As the scientific revolution gained momentum, and particularly with the advent of germ theory in the 19th century, new light was shed on his symptoms. What had once been attributed to imbalanced humours or divine wrath could now be understood through the lens of microbiology, a catastrophic, unchecked infection consuming the body from within. This understanding fundamentally reshaped the narrative, moving it from the realm of the supernatural to the scientific, albeit still terrifying. The advancements in pathology allowed for a retrospective, albeit theoretical, re-evaluation of his internal decay. The descriptions of organ failure, extreme wasting, and the pervasive odour all point strongly to systemic sepsis, likely leading to multiple organ dysfunction syndrome. The skin lesions, once so baffling, are now understood as potential manifestations of severe cellulitis, erysipelas, or even gangrene, exacerbated by poor circulation and lack of sterile care. The constant fever was the body's losing battle against an overwhelming bacterial load. This modern interpretation provides a chillingly coherent picture of his suffering, replacing bewildered speculation with informed medical insight. It's like finally seeing the clear picture on a TV screen after years of static. Yet, despite this modern clarity, the exact initial cause of the devastating infection remains an open scholarly debate. Was it a particularly virulent strain of a common bacterium that exploited a minor injury or underlying weakness? Or was Philip predisposed by some undiagnosed condition, perhaps a genetic susceptibility or a chronic illness that severely compromised his immune system, leaving him vulnerable to such an overwhelming infection? Historians and medical professionals continue to sift through the limited primary sources, searching for clues that might pinpoint the very first domino to fall in this tragic sequence. The absence of an actual autopsy report with microscopic findings means we are forever playing detective with only circumstantial evidence. The enduring fascination with Philip's case also lies in its visceral horror. The idea of a living body decomposing, emitting the stench of the grave, is profoundly unsettling. It taps into primal human fears of decay, loss of control, and the ultimate fragility of the physical self. For a king, a figure usually associated with health, power, and divine favour, to succumb to such a grotesque process only amplifies the macabre impact. This quirky or fringe tidbit, the sheer visceral repulsion of his specific demise, ensures his story continues to be told, often in hushed tones, reinforcing its legendary status. It's the kind of tale that makes you instinctively check your own skin. His prolonged suffering also serves as a potent reminder of the state of pre-modern medicine. Philip II, as one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world, had access to the best medical minds and the most exotic remedies available. Yet they were utterly powerless. Their bleedings, purges, and bizarre poultices likely exacerbated his agony and hastened his end. This stark reality underscores the monumental leaps made in medical science over the past few centuries. Today, much of what afflicted Philip would likely be treatable with antibiotics, sterile surgery, and supportive care, turning a death sentence into a manageable condition. His story is thus a powerful testament to the triumph of scientific inquiry over ignorance and superstition. The impact of his prolonged illness also echoes through the political landscape of his time. The visible weakening of the monarch inevitably created uncertainty, fueled factionalism within the court, and offered opportunities for rival powers to assert themselves. While Spain remained a dominant force, the internal stress caused by his decay rippled outwards, affecting administrative efficiency and diplomatic confidence. This connection between the king's personal health and the stability of the state is a mainstream historical fact that is evident in many monarchies throughout history, but perhaps never as dramatically as in Philip's case. The decaying body of the king became a metaphor for anxieties about the health of the empire itself. Moreover, his case highlights the often overlooked psychological toll of such a severe and repulsive illness, not only on the patient but on those around him. The king himself, living within his own putrefying body, must have endured unimaginable mental anguish. His family and attendants, forced to witness and tend to his ghastly decay, likely carried the scars of that experience for the rest of their lives. The emotional landscape of the palace during his final years must have been one of pervasive dread and profound sadness, an experience that silently shaped the characters and decisions of those who survived him. The enduring interest in Philip II's bizarre end is also a testament to human curiosity about death and disease. We are fascinated by what lies beyond the ordinary, by conditions that defy easy explanation. Philip's case, with its dramatic and horrific details, satisfies this morbid curiosity, drawing us into a narrative that is both historically significant and viscerally unsettling. It forces us to confront the fragility of the human body and the limits of our understanding, even with all the advancements of modern science. His ultimate legacy, therefore, is a complex tapestry woven from political power, personal agony, and an enduring medical mystery. He is remembered not just for his imperial reach, but for the horrifying, unique way his life ended. The king who rotted alive stands as a chilling monument in history, a stark reminder of the relentless power of disease and the long, arduous journey of human knowledge in its conquest. His story continues to be a dark fable, a whisper in the night about the body's ultimate betrayal, ensuring his place in the collective memory is as much about his gruesome demise as it is about his formidable reign. The chilling echoes of Philip II's final years, consumed by a decay so profound it seemed to defy nature, ultimately lead us to his enduring resting place, the royal crypt of El Escorial. Here, beneath the solemn grandeur of the monastery palace he himself commissioned, his remains lie, a physical testament to a life that ended in the most macabre fashion. The legacy of his putrefaction continues to cling to his memory, a perpetual question mark hanging over one of history's most powerful monarchs. The sheer uniqueness of his demise ensured that the king's body, even in death, remained an object of morbid fascination. While embalming practices of the era were attempted, they were often rudimentary and ultimately insufficient against such advanced putrefaction. It is highly likely that the sheer extent of his decay presented an unprecedented challenge to those tasked with preparing his body for burial. The historical accounts of his bodily state suggest a rapid and ongoing process of decomposition, leaving little doubt that his remains would have been far from pristine, even after attempts at preservation. The logistics of preparing such a body for a public viewing and a grand royal funeral would have been a macabre undertaking, requiring significant effort to mask the horrifying reality. This practical challenge is a mainstream historical fact, albeit one often glossed over, underscoring the grim reality of his end. His coffin, interred within the pantheon of kings at El Escorial, joins those of his ancestors and successors, creating a silent community of the departed Habsburgs. Yet, his presence there is unique, forever associated with the horrific process that led him to that final resting place. The cool, quiet stones of the crypt hold the secret of his suffering, a stark contrast to the grand, public life he led. One can almost feel the lingering questions hanging in the subterranean air, an atmospheric residue of the mystery that consumed him. The lingering questions about the specific nature of his rotting alive continue to pique curiosity. While modern medical consensus leans towards an overwhelming systemic infection leading to widespread necrosis, the precise initial cause remains elusive. Was it a highly aggressive bacterial strain that found a vulnerable host? Could it have been an undiagnosed, rapidly progressive autoimmune disorder that caused tissue breakdown, then complicated by infection? Or was it a combination of factors, a perfect, tragic storm of disease, environmental conditions, and the limitations of 16th century medicine? This medical enigma remains an open scholarly debate, a cold case that continues to tantalize pathologists and historians alike. Without more definitive contemporary medical records or, impossibly, surviving tissue samples, the full truth remains locked in the past. A quirky or fringe tidbit that some more sensational historical accounts might whisper relates to the idea that the odour of decay, so potent in his final days, persisted even after his death, perhaps even clinging to his burial clothes or the very stone of his tomb. While clearly an exaggeration born of morbid fascination, it speaks to the profound impression his particular suffering left on the collective imagination. The idea of a king whose very remains emanated death, long after his spirit had departed, only adds to the macabre legend surrounding him. It's a bit like a horror movie where the monster's presence can still be sensed, even after it's gone. The enduring fascination with his case also serves as a potent historical marker, highlighting the dramatic shifts in human understanding of disease. Philip II's death represents the apotheosis of suffering in an era utterly devoid of the medical knowledge and tools we now take for granted. His physicians, for all their earnest efforts and intellectual prowess, were essentially blind, battling an unseen enemy with ineffective weapons. His agonizing demise underscores the profound impact of scientific breakthroughs like germ theory and antibiotics, which have transformed once fatal conditions into treatable ailments. He is a tragic symbol of a time when even the most powerful individuals were utterly at the mercy of their own biology. The royal crypt itself, a place of profound silence and historical weight, holds a silent testament to the impermanence of all things, even kings and empires. The grand marble sarcophagi contain the remains of monarchs who shaped the destiny of nations, yet all ultimately succumbed to the same finality. Philip's unique suffering only emphasises this universal truth. His powerful reign, his vast empire, his formidable will, all ultimately surrendered to the relentless process of bodily decay. He became, in his final years, a living, breathing symbol of mortality, his body a gruesome canvas for the ultimate human frailty. His personal legacy, beyond the political achievements, is forever intertwined with his suffering. He is remembered not just as the powerful ruler who built El Escorial, but as the king whose body betrayed him in the most horrifying way imaginable. This tragic personal narrative humanizes him, making him more than just a figure on a throne, but a man who endured an unimaginable ordeal. His story resonates because it taps into our deepest fears about illness and death, reminding us of the fragility of the human condition. The very concept of a king rotting alive continues to provoke a visceral reaction. It transcends mere historical interest and delves into the realm of the truly unsettling. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, perhaps because it challenges our perceptions of life and death, blurring the lines between the living and the dead. The image of a sovereign, still breathing, yet consumed by the processes of decomposition, is a haunting one that stays with the listener long after the narrative concludes. And so, as we leave the silent grandeur of El Escorial and the chilling legacy of Philip II, we are left to ponder the profound mystery of his final days. The king whose body slowly dissolved, whose flesh succumbed to the ravages of an unknown internal enemy, remains a powerful testament to the relentless, often brutal, nature of disease in an era before modern medicine offered even a sliver of hope. His story, etched in the annals of history and whispered through the generations, serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the immense suffering that can befall even the mightiest among us. It is a chilling end to a powerful life, a tale that underscores the ultimate truth that even kings, in the end, are but flesh and bone.